I'd barely lifted my coffee cup when my daughter looked at me and said, "Mom, please stop talking. You embarrass us." The words weren't shouted. That somehow made them worse. I lowered the cup slowly and set it back onto the saucer before my hands could betray the slight tremble in my fingers. No one at the table gasped. No one looked surprised. That was the part that stayed with me. Not what Claire said, but how normal it seemed to everyone else. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and if you'd like, tell me where you're listening from." Sometimes it helps to remember that somewhere out there, strangers can offer more kindness than the people sitting across the table. The string quartet near the floor-to-ceiling windows continued playing a soft jazz arrangement of "What a Wonderful World." Sunlight spilled across the polished wood floors of the Grand Willow Country Club. Servers moved gracefully between tables carrying trays of mimosas, fresh fruit, and eggs Benedict. All around me, families were celebrating Mother's Day. Daughters hugged their mothers. Grandchildren posed for photographs. Laughter floated through the room like warm air. And at table 12, I suddenly felt like an unwanted guest at my own life. "I was only asking the woman where she bought her earrings," I said quietly. Claire sighed. Not dramatically. Just enough. The way someone sighs when a child has become difficult. "Mom, that's not the point." I looked at her. At 48, my daughter had perfected a certain expression. It appeared often in public. The smile remained. The eyes hardened. "You make people uncomfortable sometimes." Uncomfortable. The word settled heavily between us. Daniel immediately focused on cutting his food. My son-in-law had mastered the art of disappearing without physically leaving the room. Across from me, my granddaughter Sophie stared down at her folded napkin. She was 20 years old now. A sophomore at Northwestern. Beautiful. Smart. Kind. And at that moment she looked deeply embarrassed. Not by me. By her mother. I recognized the difference. After all, I'd spent 70 years learning how to read faces. The room suddenly felt too bright. Too loud. Too public. I glanced around the table. White linen. Crystal glasses. Silver flatware. Fresh flowers in a low centerpiece. Everything looked perfect. That was Claire's specialty. Making everything look perfect. When she was little, she used to line up her dolls in perfect rows. When she became a teenager, she color-coded her closet. When she became an adult, she curated her life the same way some people curate museums. Nothing messy. Nothing embarrassing. Nothing that might ruin the picture. Unfortunately, mothers grow old. And old age isn't particularly photogenic. A waiter approached carrying a bouquet of pale pink roses wrapped in satin ribbon. His smile widened as he stopped beside our table. "Happy Mother's Day, Mrs. Bennett." Claire's face lit up instantly. Oh my goodness. The roses were beautiful. Large blooms. Perfectly arranged. Expensive. The waiter handed them to her. "Compliments of your mother-in-law." Claire pressed a hand against her chest. "That's so sweet." Daniel kissed her cheek. Several women at nearby tables smiled admiringly. The waiter lingered long enough to witness the moment before moving on. Claire carefully arranged the bouquet beside her champagne glass. The flowers seemed to glow in the sunlight. I watched everyone admire them. No one seemed to notice that I hadn't received so much as a card. Not from Claire. Not from Daniel. Not even from Sophie. The realization arrived quietly, like rain beginning somewhere far away. No dramatic heartbreak. No tears. Just a simple fact. I had remembered every Mother's Day of Claire's childhood. Every homemade card. Every wilted dandelion bouquet. Every school craft glued together with too much glitter. I remembered helping her with science projects, driving her to ballet lessons, working double shifts after her father died, skipping vacations, skipping new clothes, sometimes skipping meals. There were years when I worried constantly about money, years when I lay awake calculating grocery bills, years when the transmission in my old Buick sounded like it might explode at any moment. But Claire never knew. That was the point. Parents protect their children from certain worries. At least, that's what I believed. And now here we were, at a country club brunch, surrounded by wealth and polished manners. And somehow I had become the embarrassment. Claire caught me looking at the flowers. She smiled politely. Sandra always knows how to make people feel special. Sandra. Her husband's mother. The grandmother featured in nearly every family photograph Claire posted online. Sandra at Christmas. Sandra at the lake house. Sandra at graduation. Sandra at birthday parties. Sandra smiling beside Sophie. I wasn't jealous of Sandra. Not really. I like Sandra. But lately I'd begun noticing something. When people asked Claire about her family, she talked about Sandra first. As though I existed somewhere farther down the list. An afterthought. A footnote. A biological detail. The quartet shifted into another song. Outside the windows, golfers crossed the green under a cloudless May sky. Everything looked beautiful, which somehow made the ache worse. Because pain is easier to bear when the world acknowledges it. Not when the world keeps smiling. Sophie finally looked up. Grandma, how's your garden doing? The question was small, but I recognized it for what it was. A lifeline. I smiled. It's coming along. What did you plant this year? Peonies. Tomatoes. Lavender. Her face brightened slightly. You always grow the best tomatoes. Claire glanced at her phone. Daniel checked his watch. The conversation died almost immediately. I looked down at my untouched French toast. Powdered sugar. Fresh strawberries. Whipped cream. Food I suddenly had no appetite for. For a moment, I wondered if I really did make people uncomfortable. Age can do strange things to a person's confidence. You start questioning yourself. Maybe I talked too much. Maybe I repeated stories. Maybe I wasn't keeping up with social cues. Maybe no. The thought stopped there. Because asking a woman about her earrings wasn't rude. Being treated like a burden was. A few minutes later, Claire leaned toward Daniel. She lowered her voice. Not enough. I can't keep bringing her to these events if she's going to act like this. Something inside me went still. Very still. Not shattered. Not broken. Just quiet. Like a house after everyone has left. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Claire. He said her name softly, but there was no real objection in it. Only caution. Not don't do this. Just not here. Not now. The distinction mattered. I looked at my daughter. Really looked at her. The expensive dress. The pearl earrings. The carefully maintained smile. And suddenly I felt older than I had that morning. Not physically. Emotionally. Like I had crossed into a room I wasn't supposed to enter. A room where the truth had been waiting. Sophie shifted uncomfortably. Mom. Claire ignored her. I realized then that Sophie had seen this before. The thought hurt more than anything else. Children should never become accustomed to cruelty. Especially quiet cruelty. I folded my napkin. I think I'm going to head home. The words surprised even me. Claire exhaled. Almost silently. But I heard it. Relief. That's probably for the best. The sentence landed harder than the first one. Because it confirmed everything. I wasn't leaving because I wanted to. I was leaving because my absence made things easier. Sophie looked stricken. Grandma, wait. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Her fingers were warm. It's all right, sweetheart. No, it isn't. The words escaped before she could stop them. Claire's eyes immediately snapped toward her. The silence that followed felt sharp enough to cut paper. Sophie lowered her gaze. Daniel cleared his throat. And just like that, the moment disappeared. Buried alive beneath politeness. I stood slowly. My knees weren't what they used to be. The chair scraped softly against the floor. No one offered to walk me out. No one asked me to stay. I smoothed the wrinkles from my blue cardigan. The one Sophie had bought me 2 Christmases ago. Then I picked up my purse. As I walked through the dining room, I passed table after table of families celebrating together. A little girl handed her mother a handmade card. An elderly woman laughed as her son kissed her cheek. Someone nearby posed for a photograph. I smiled politely whenever someone looked my way. Years of practice. You learn that dignity sometimes means carrying your pain. Privately. Near the entrance stood a large gold-framed mirror. I paused without meaning to. The woman reflected there looked familiar. Yet somehow distant. Silver hair neatly pinned back. Soft wrinkles. Careful posture. A woman trying very hard not to look hurt. Behind me, reflected across the room, I could still see table 12. Claire laughing. Daniel smiling. The pink roses displayed proudly in the center. Sophie staring down into her lap. The image looked complete, balanced, perfect, as though I had already been removed. Then I heard it. Claire's voice. Quiet, careless, the kind of honesty people reveal when they think you're gone. Honestly, she ruins every room she walks into. A few women laughed awkwardly. Not because it was funny, because they didn't know what else to do. Sophie didn't laugh. I noticed that. Even then. Especially then. I stood there for one long second, looking at my reflection, listening to my daughter's words settle somewhere deep inside me. Not like a knife. Knives are sudden. This felt different. This felt like finally seeing a crack that had been running through a wall for years. A crack I'd spent too long pretending wasn't there. Then I pushed open the country club doors. Bright sunlight flooded across the stone entrance. Warm May air brushed against my face. And for the first time that day, I realized something that frightened me more than Claire's cruelty. The humiliation hadn't started at brunch. Brunch was simply the first time I stopped making excuses for it. The drive home took 23 minutes. I know that because I counted every red light. Not on purpose. Not at first. But when your heart is too full to cry, the mind finds small, useless things to hold on to. 3 red lights on Willow Avenue. 1 school crossing sign flashing even though school was closed for Sunday. 2 joggers near the park. A white pickup truck with a cracked taillight. A woman walking a golden retriever beside a row of blooming dogwoods. Everything outside my windshield looked ordinary. That felt almost insulting. The world should change when something inside you breaks. But it doesn't. People keep trimming hedges. Children keep riding bicycles. Mailboxes keep standing at the ends of driveways with their little red flags lowered. Somewhere someone burns toast. Somewhere someone laughs too loudly. Somewhere, a daughter buys flowers for her mother without being reminded. I kept both hands on the steering wheel. At 70 years old, I had learned not to drive while emotional. My late husband, Thomas, used to tease me about how careful I was. Margaret, you drive like you're transporting museum glass. Maybe I did. But that afternoon, I was grateful for every cautious habit he'd ever teased me about. I stayed in my lane. I used my turn signal. I checked my mirrors twice. I did all the things a woman does when she is trying not to fall apart in traffic. Claire's voice followed me all the way home. You embarrass us. She ruins every room she walks into. The words did not come back as sentences. They came back as temperature. Cold in my chest. Cold behind my ribs. Cold enough that I turned the heat on, even though it was a bright May afternoon and the dashboard said 74 degrees. At the last intersection before my neighborhood, I stopped behind a minivan with 3 little stick-figure children on the back window. The smallest one had a pink bow on its head. I stared at it longer than I should have. When Claire was 5, she used to draw our family with oversized heads and skinny legs. Me, Thomas, and her. Always holding hands. Always standing under a yellow sun. Sometimes she drew our old brown dog, Max, floating above us like he had learned to fly. She would bring those drawings to me from kindergarten, still smelling faintly of crayons and paste, and say, "Don't lose this one, Mommy. It's important." I never did. There was still a box of them in the upstairs hall closet. I wondered when a child stops drawing her mother into the picture. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. For a while I didn't move. The house stood in front of me, pale gray with white shutters, the same colonial Thomas and I bought 32 years ago when Claire was 16 and furious about leaving our old neighborhood. The front porch sagged slightly on the left side no matter how many times I had it repaired. The hydrangeas along the walkway were just beginning to show green buds. A wind chime Sophie made in 6th grade hung near the porch rail, faded now, its little blue glass pieces cloudy from years of sun. It made a soft sound in the breeze. Thin, fragile, like a memory trying to speak. Across the street, Mrs. Donnelly was kneeling by her flower bed in a wide straw hat. She looked up, lifted one gloved hand and waved. I waved back. A normal wave. A neighbor wave. The kind that said everything is fine, thank you, lovely day, yes, the roses are early this year. Then I sat there until she went back to her tulips. Only then did I let my hands fall from the steering wheel. They looked old. I don't usually think of my hands that way. They have always just been my hands. Hands that braided Claire's hair before school. Hands that scrubbed casserole dishes after church potlucks. Hands that held Thomas's fingers in the hospital when the machines around him began making softer sounds. Hands that signed tuition checks and mortgage papers and birthday cards. But in that moment, resting in my lap, they looked like the hands of someone other people had already begun placing gently aside. I got out of the car carefully. The air smelled like cut grass and lilacs. Mother's Day. That was the part that kept pressing against me. Not a random Sunday. Not a forgotten lunch. Mother's Day. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet house. The silence met me at once. It was not new. I had lived alone for 8 years since Thomas passed. I knew the sounds of this house better than I knew most people. The low hum of the refrigerator. The tick of the hallway clock. The small creak near the bottom stair. The faint settling of old pipes when the afternoon sun warmed the walls. But that day the silence felt different. Not peaceful. Waiting. I set my purse on the narrow table by the door, beside the ceramic bowl where Thomas used to drop his keys every evening. His keys were still there. Not the car keys, of course. Those had gone with the Buick when I sold it. But the old brass house key, the mailbox key, and a little silver key neither Claire nor I had ever identified. I kept them because I couldn't bear to throw away something his hands had touched every day. On the dining room table sat a small vase of carnations. Pink and white. I had bought them for myself the day before at Kroger. The young cashier had smiled when she scanned them. Getting flowers for someone special? I had smiled back. Yes, I said. And that had been true, even if I hadn't meant it bravely at the time. Now the carnations looked almost apologetic in the middle of the table. Their stems leaned slightly to one side. I took off my cardigan and hung it on the back of a chair instead of putting it in the closet. Then I walked into the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and washed my hands though there was nothing on them. Warm water ran over my fingers. I watched it disappear down the drain. For a moment I thought of all the dinners I had cooked in this kitchen for Claire. The grilled cheese cut diagonally because she said triangles tasted better. The chicken noodle soup when she had strep throat in 3rd grade. The pancakes shaped like lopsided hearts on Valentine's Day. The graduation brunch when she wore her Northwestern sweatshirt and rolled her eyes because I cried while slicing melon. I had been so proud of her. Painfully proud. The kind of pride that makes a mother forget herself. The phone rang. I jumped. The sound cut through the kitchen so sharply I almost laughed. For one foolish second I thought it might be Claire calling to apologize. Not a grand apology. I wasn't unreasonable. I didn't expect tears or confessions. Just a small softening. Mom, I shouldn't have said that. Mom, are you home safe?
Mom, I'm sorry.
I dried my hands on a dish towel and picked up the phone from the counter. Claire. Her name glowed on the screen. I answered carefully. Hello. There was a pause. Not long. Just enough for me to hear faint voices behind her. The soft roar of the country club dining room. Mom, she said. Did you get home? Yes. Good. Another pause. I waited. I could hear her moving somewhere quieter. Maybe the hallway near the ladies' lounge. Maybe the patio. I pictured her standing in sunlight, one hand on her phone, the other pressed against her forehead as though I had caused a scheduling problem. You left very abruptly, she said. I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. Thomas's old bird feeder swung empty from the maple tree. I had forgotten to refill it that morning. I thought it was best. Claire exhaled. See, that's what I mean. You do this. I tightened my hand around the phone. Do what? You turn things into scenes. I actually looked around the empty kitchen. There was no scene. Only me. A sink. A dish towel. A vase of grocery store carnations in the next room. I didn't raise my voice, I said. No, but you made everyone uncomfortable by leaving like that. There it was again. Uncomfortable. Apparently, discomfort was always my responsibility. Claire, I said gently, you told me I embarrassed you in front of your family. My family. Her tone sharpened. That's not fair. I closed my eyes. I meant at the table. You always make it sound like I'm excluding you. I opened my eyes again. The backyard blurred slightly. Are you? Silence. This one lasted longer. When Claire spoke again, her voice had changed. Softer. Controlled. Mom, I'm not doing this today. It's Mother's Day. I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny. Because if I didn't find some small corner of irony, the hurt might have become too large to hold. Yes, I said. I know. You have to understand something. Daniel and I live in a certain world now. There are expectations, social things, business connections, board members, donors, people who don't always understand your way of talking to strangers. My way of talking to strangers. Asking a woman about her earrings had become a character flaw. Our world, I repeated quietly. Claire didn't seem to hear the weight of it. Yes, and I'm not saying you're wrong for being who you are. I'm just saying sometimes you need to be aware of context. Context. Another polished word for shame. I leaned against the kitchen counter. A small brown medication bottle sat beside the sink. Blood pressure pills. I had placed them there after breakfast so I wouldn't forget the evening dose. Thomas used to line up his pills the same way in his final months, orange bottles like tiny warnings along the windowsill. Claire, I said, did you invite me today because you wanted me there? Of course. The answer came too quickly, too smoothly. Or because it would have looked bad if you didn't? A sharper silence. Then a small laugh. Not amused. Defensive. That's exactly what I'm talking about. You take everything personally. I stared at the carnations. I am your mother. And I'm your daughter. But that doesn't mean I can manage your feelings every time you're disappointed. Disappointed. Such a small word. It sounded like I had wanted a better table. A warmer croissant. A nicer view of the garden. Not basic kindness. Claire, someone said faintly in the background. Daniel probably. I have to go, she said. We'll talk later when you're calmer. I was calm. That was the strange part. My voice was steady. My breathing was even. Only one hand trembled and she couldn't see that. All right, I said. And Mom? Yes. Please don't call Sophie and make her feel guilty. She had a nice day. Don't put her in the middle. There it was. A door closing before I had even reached for it. I would never do that to her. I know you don't mean to. Meaning to. Not meaning to. Intentions had become Claire's favorite hiding place. The call ended before I could say anything else. I stood in the kitchen with the phone still against my ear, listening to nothing. Then I set it down. Very carefully. I remembered once, years ago, when Claire was 13 and had slammed her bedroom door so hard the little framed picture in the hallway fell and cracked. Thomas had wanted to march upstairs and make her apologize. I told him no. Let her be angry. Girls need somewhere safe to be difficult. I had given Claire so much safety, so much room to be difficult. I wondered when she had decided I no longer deserved the same. The afternoon stretched ahead of me. Long quiet. I took the French toast container from my purse. The waiter had boxed it without asking after I stood to leave. A kind gesture. Or perhaps an efficient one. I placed it in the refrigerator though I knew I would not eat it. Beside it sat half a carton of eggs, a small container of chicken salad, and the lemon cake I had baked Friday because Sophie once said mine tasted better than the bakery's. I had thought perhaps they might stop by after brunch. Just for coffee. Just for 15 minutes. I had set out 4 dessert plates that morning before driving to the club. I saw them now on the counter. Waiting. I put them away one by one. The first plate clicked softly against the second. The sound filled the kitchen. I moved slowly not because I had to, but because there was no reason to rush. No one was coming. No doorbell would ring. No granddaughter would burst in asking for iced tea. No daughter would walk through the door with a sheepish expression and say, Mom, I was awful today. So I washed the coffee mugs that were already clean. I wiped the counter twice. I folded the dish towel and unfolded it again. Finally, I went upstairs. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender sachets and old wood. On the wall were framed photographs I had never had the heart to update. Claire at 8 missing her front teeth. Claire in her prom dress, one hand on Thomas's arm. Claire holding Sophie as a newborn, exhausted and glowing. A family photo from 10 years ago, taken on the front porch before Thomas got sick. All of us squinting into the sunlight. Daniel's hand on Claire's shoulder. Sophie leaning against my hip. Thomas smiling in that calm, steady way of his. I stopped in front of that picture. Thomas had always known how to read Claire. Better than I did sometimes. She wants the world to clap for her. He once told me when Claire was in her 30s and upset because a work dinner hadn't gone the way she hoped. Is that so terrible? I asked. No, he said. Not unless she starts mistaking applause for love. At the time I thought he was being too hard on her. Thomas could be gentle, but he was rarely fooled. I touched the edge of the frame. You saw more than I did, I whispered. The house did not answer. I went to the hall closet and opened the door. Inside were winter coats, old board games, wrapping paper, a vacuum cleaner, and 3 plastic storage bins filled with things I had saved because mothers save evidence that they were loved. I pulled down the smallest bin and carried it to my bedroom. My knees protested when I lowered myself onto the edge of the bed. The bin lid popped open with a soft crack. Inside were Claire's childhood drawings, report cards, handmade cards, a macaroni necklace painted gold, a Mother's Day booklet from 2nd grade. The cover said, "My mom is special because..." The crayon letters were uneven. I opened it. My mom is special because she makes soup when I am sick. My mom is special because she smells like vanilla. My mom is special because she always listens. I read that line 3 times. She always listens. The paper blurred. I pressed the heel of my hand gently beneath one eye. Only 1 tear fell. I let it. Then I closed the booklet and placed it back inside the bin. Grief for a living child is a strange thing. No one brings casseroles. No one sends cards. No one stands beside you and says, "I'm sorry for your loss." Because the person is still alive. Still calling. Still hosting brunch. Still smiling in photographs. But something has died all the same. A version of them. A version of you. A version of love you thought would survive ordinary disappointment. The doorbell rang at 5:12. I knew the time because the clock on my nightstand ticked loudly in the quiet room. For half a second my heart lifted. Then I hated myself for it. Hope can be humiliating when it keeps showing up uninvited. I went downstairs slowly. Through the glass panel beside the front door, I saw a delivery man holding a small white box. "Mrs. Margaret Whitmore?" he asked when I opened the door. "Yes. Delivery for you." I signed the little screen with my finger. The box was light. Too small for flowers. Too neatly wrapped to be groceries. After he left, I carried it to the dining room table and opened it with scissors. Inside was a candle. Vanilla lavender. There was a printed card. "Happy Mother's Day, Margaret." Warmly, Sandra Bennett. I stared at the card. Sandra. Claire's mother-in-law. The woman who had received public roses at brunch. The woman Claire praised for knowing how to make people feel special. She had sent me a candle. Not a grand gift. Not expensive. But thoughtful. Remembered. I sat down at the dining room table. For a moment, I didn't know what to do with that kindness. It was almost worse than cruelty because it proved how little effort love required. A name. A date. A small gesture. Someone had remembered me. Just not my daughter. I set the candle beside the carnations. The flowers looked less lonely that way. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Sophie. "Grandma, are you okay?" I read the text once. Then again. I typed, "I'm home safe, sweetheart. Thank you for asking." 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Then her reply came. "I'm sorry about today." I stood in the dining room, one hand pressed lightly against the chair back. There it was. The apology I had needed. Not from the person who owed it, but from the person who had been forced to witness the damage. I typed slowly, "You don't need to apologize for adults." Her response came almost immediately. "I know, but I still am." I looked toward the front window. The sun was lowering now, turning the neighborhood gold. Mrs. Donnelly had gone inside. The street was quiet. A robin hopped across my lawn, tilting its head as though listening for something underground. I wanted to tell Sophie everything. That her mother had hurt me. That I felt invisible. That I was beginning to wonder whether this had been happening for years while I politely explained it away. But Claire's warning echoed in my ear. Don't put her in the middle. So I wrote only, "I love you." Sophie replied, "I love you too, Grandma." I held the phone to my chest. Not dramatically. No one was there to see it. It was simply where the message belonged. Close to the place that had been hurting all day. That evening I made tea instead of dinner. Chamomile in the mug Thomas bought me from a roadside pottery shop in Vermont. The glaze was blue and uneven, his favorite kind of imperfect thing. I sat at the kitchen table while twilight gathered at the windows. The candle from Sandra remained unlit in the dining room. The carnations leaned further in their vase. Upstairs, the box of Claire's childhood things sat open on my bed. I knew I should put everything away before I forgot. But part of me wanted it left. Open. Not as punishment. As evidence. Once I had been loved simply. Once my daughter had thought my soup mattered. My vanilla perfume mattered. My listening mattered. Maybe that girl was still inside Claire somewhere. Or maybe that was another excuse I had been using to survive the woman she had become. I took a small sip of tea. It had gone lukewarm. Outside, the wind chime rang once. A thin blue sound. And sitting alone in that old kitchen on Mother's Day evening, I finally allowed myself to ask the question I had avoided for years. When did my daughter stop seeing me as her mother? And start seeing me as something to manage? The next morning I woke up at 5:47. Not because I had somewhere to be. Not because of an alarm. At my age, grief and disappointment often function as their own alarm clock. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. The room was gray with early morning light. For a few seconds I didn't remember why my chest felt heavy. Then I did. Mother's Day. Claire. The country club. The roses. The relief in her voice when I said I was leaving. I closed my eyes again. Sometimes memory arrives all at once. Sometimes it arrives in pieces. That morning it came back like a series of small cuts. I got out of bed, pulled on a robe and made coffee. The house was still quiet. The old coffee maker sputtered and hissed. Outside the kitchen window, the first birds had begun moving through the maple tree. Everything looked peaceful. The kind of peaceful that belongs to houses where nothing is wrong. The kind that can fool you. I carried my mug to the dining room. The carnations were still there. Sandra's candle sat beside them. For some reason, seeing both together made me unexpectedly emotional. One woman had remembered me. My own daughter had not. The contrast was difficult to ignore. I sat down and opened the newspaper. I read the same paragraph 3 times without understanding a word. My mind kept drifting elsewhere. Backward. Toward memories I had spent years explaining away. At the time, each incident seemed small. Reasonable. Understandable. That was the danger. Major betrayals rarely begin as major betrayals. They begin as tiny exclusions, tiny dismissals, tiny adjustments. One day you realize those tiny things have become your entire relationship. I remembered Sophie's 8th birthday party. The memory appeared suddenly while I stirred cream into my coffee. I had bought Sophie a watercolor set she'd been talking about for months. Nothing extravagant. Just a nice wooden box with paints, brushes, and thick paper. She loved drawing back then. I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early, only to discover everyone had already eaten. The party had started an hour sooner than planned. At least that was the explanation Claire gave. "Oh no," she said, pressing a hand against her chest. "Didn't Daniel text you?" "No." Her smile tightened. "We must have gotten mixed up." At the time I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Families misunderstand things occasionally. I stayed for cake. Watched Sophie open gifts. Took pictures. Went home. It wasn't until much later that I learned everyone else had received the correct time. Everyone except me. I had accidentally discovered that truth when Sophie's other grandmother mentioned arriving exactly when Claire instructed. The realization stung. But even then I explained it away. Claire was busy. Claire was stressed. Claire didn't mean it. Looking back now, I wondered how many times I had mistaken a pattern for an accident. The phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Donnelly. "Need tomatoes this summer?" My seedlings got out of control again. I smiled despite myself. That was typical Evelyn Donnelly. Every spring she planted too many vegetables. Every summer she gave them away to half the neighborhood. I replied, "Only if you take some zucchini from me later." 3 seconds later, deal. The exchange lasted less than a minute. Yet somehow it felt warmer than most conversations I'd had with Claire lately. That thought made me uncomfortable. Not because it wasn't true. Because it was. After breakfast, I decided to clean the upstairs linen closet. It didn't need cleaning. But organizing things gave my hands something to do while my mind wandered. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting cross-legged on the hallway floor surrounded by old blankets, photo albums, and forgotten boxes. One album slipped from a stack and landed open. Sophie's kindergarten graduation. There she was.
Tin capítol.
Tiny gown. Gap-toothed smile. My finger paused over the photograph. I remembered that day. Or rather, I remembered almost missing that day. Claire had called me the night before. We're keeping it really small. Of course. Just immediate family. The phrase had hurt, though I couldn't quite explain why. At the time I didn't challenge it. I simply accepted it. Then Sophie herself called. She was 6. Grandma, are you coming tomorrow? The question surprised me. I didn't think I was invited. There was silence. Then confusion. What do you mean? The next morning I attended anyway. Claire was polite. Pleasant even. But I noticed something. Every time someone introduced me as Sophie's grandmother, Claire quickly redirected the conversation elsewhere. At the time I thought I imagined it. Now I wasn't so sure. I sat back against the hallway wall, the photo album resting across my knees, and for the first time I allowed myself to examine the memories without defending Claire. The difference was startling. It was like cleaning a window and realizing the glass had been dirty for years. Another memory surfaced. Christmas. 3 years ago. The year after Daniel became partner at his firm. Claire hosted an enormous holiday dinner. 30 guests. Maybe more. The house looked like something from a magazine. Fresh garland. Crystal ornaments. Matching napkins. Everything coordinated. Everything perfect. When I arrived, my usual seat was gone. Not intentionally, Claire assured me. Just a last-minute adjustment. A children's table had been expanded. Space was limited. These things happen. I ended up at the far end of a folding table beside 2 distant cousins and a teenage boy who spent the evening staring at his phone. Again it seemed small. Petty almost. Not worth mentioning. Yet I remembered sitting there while everyone laughed together at the main table. I remembered looking toward Claire. Waiting for her to notice. Waiting for her to say, "Mom, come sit closer." She never did. The memory hurt more now than it had then. Perhaps because I finally understood what made it painful. Not the chair. The message. Someone else's place mattered more than mine. I closed the album. My hands felt strangely cold. By lunchtime, the house seemed full of ghosts. Not Thomas. Not even old grief. Just old moments. Moments I had buried because acknowledging them would have forced me to ask difficult questions. Questions mothers often avoid. Does my daughter actually enjoy my company? Would she still include me if social expectations didn't require it? When did obligation replace affection? The doorbell rang. I glanced at the clock. 11:42. For a moment I hoped it might be Sophie. Instead, it was a delivery truck dropping off a package for the neighbor. I laughed softly at myself. Hope really was stubborn. That afternoon I drove to the grocery store. Partly because I needed milk. Mostly because sitting alone with my thoughts felt dangerous. The store was busy. Monday shoppers. Retirees. Young parents. People debating cereal brands. Normal life. I pushed my cart slowly through produce. Tomatoes. Lettuce. Strawberries. Near the bakery section, I heard someone call my name. Margaret. I turned. It was Linda Carver, a woman I'd known for nearly 20 years through church and community events. We chatted briefly. Gardens. Weather. Her grandson's baseball team. Ordinary things. Then she smiled. How was Mother's Day? The question hit harder than expected. Not because she meant any harm. Because she didn't. I hesitated. Just long enough. Linda noticed. Her expression softened. Oh, honey. That was all she said. Just those 2 words. Yet somehow she understood more than Claire had in years. I looked away, embarrassed by the sudden sting behind my eyes. Linda touched my arm gently. You know something? What? My mother used to say that people reveal who they are by how they treat the person who loves them most. I swallowed. Neither of us mentioned Claire. We didn't need to. After she left, I stood alone beside the bakery display for several seconds. Thinking hard. Because a terrible possibility had begun forming. What if Claire hadn't changed recently? What if she had been changing for years? And what if I simply refused to see it? That possibility followed me home. Followed me while I unloaded groceries. Followed me while I watered the peonies. Followed me while I folded laundry. By evening, it had settled beside me like an unwelcome guest. The final memory arrived after dinner. Unexpected. Sharp. Sophie's high school scholarship ceremony. Only 2 years ago, I remembered sitting in the auditorium, proud beyond words. Sophie's name had been called. She walked across the stage, confident, graceful, everything a grandmother hopes to see. Afterward, families gathered in the lobby for photographs. I waited, holding a small bouquet of flowers, watching groups form around their students, parents, grandparents, siblings, everyone taking pictures. I looked for Claire. Eventually I found her, across the room, posing with Daniel, Sophie, several donors, a university representative. They were already taking photos. Without me. For a moment I assumed they would call me over. Any second now. Any second. But they didn't. The photographer snapped picture after picture. And I remained standing 30 feet away holding flowers. Invisible. Then Sophie spotted me. I still remembered the expression on her face. Alarm. Almost guilt. She immediately walked over. Grandma, why are you standing over here? I didn't want to interrupt. Her eyes flicked toward her parents. Then back to me. You wouldn't be interrupting. A few minutes later she insisted on taking pictures together. Just the two of us. At the time I thought that was the happy ending. Now I saw something else. Sophie had noticed. Long before I did. The realization settled heavily inside me. Perhaps that was why she looked so uncomfortable at brunch. Because she wasn't witnessing something new. She was witnessing something familiar. The thought broke my heart. Not for myself. For her. No child should spend years watching one family member slowly erase another. The evening sun stretched across the living room carpet. Golden. Quiet. I sat in Thomas's old armchair and looked toward the framed family photographs on the mantel. The strange thing was that every picture told the same story. Smiling faces. Holiday dinners. Vacations. Birthdays. Perfect moments. Yet now I found myself wondering what existed just outside the frame. Who was included? Who was forgotten? Who was tolerated? Who was loved? The phone buzzed again. A text from Sophie. Grandma? Yes, sweetheart? Can I come see you tomorrow? I stared at the screen. Something about the question felt important. Not casual. Not random. I typed, of course. Anytime. 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. Then returned. Finally her message arrived. There's something I think you should know. I sat very still. The room suddenly quieter than before. Outside, the wind chime moved softly in the evening breeze. My eyes remained fixed on the screen. The next message came a few seconds later. I don't think Mom has been honest with you about a lot of things. My heart gave one slow, heavy beat. Not panic. Not shock. Something else. Recognition. The feeling you get when a puzzle piece finally clicks into place. Because deep down, somewhere beneath years of excuses and explanations, I already knew. Mother's Day hadn't created the problem. It had only exposed it. And for the first time in a very long time, someone else was finally willing to say it out loud. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of what Sophie had written. Because of what she hadn't. There's something I think you should know. The sentence lingered in my mind long after I turned off the bedside lamp. I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house. The refrigerator humming downstairs. The old maple branches brushing against the roof. The occasional creak settling through the walls. 32 years in this house had taught me its language. Every sound meant something. Every silence meant something too. Around 2 in the morning, I got out of bed and walked into the hallway. The moonlight coming through the stairwell window cast pale rectangles across the floor. On the wall hung the family photographs. I stopped in front of them again. Not because I wanted to, because I couldn't seem to stop. One photograph in particular caught my attention. Claire's college graduation. Northwestern. The day had been brutally hot. I remembered sweating through my blouse while sitting in the crowded stadium, Thomas had laughed at me because I brought an umbrella to block the sun. Margaret, people are going to think we're at a beach. I don't care. You never do. That made me smile even now. He had always loved that about me. Or at least he claimed he did. I looked at Claire's face in the photograph. 22 years old. Bright eyes. Wide smile. One arm wrapped around my shoulders. The other around Thomas. Back then she wanted us in every picture. Back then she introduced us proudly. My parents. Never just my mother. Never an obligation. Never an inconvenience. The thought followed me back to bed. And eventually, somewhere near dawn, I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning arrived with rain. A soft, steady rain. The kind that turned everything silver. I stood at the kitchen sink holding a coffee mug and watching water slide down the backyard fence. At 10:15, Sophie's car pulled into the driveway. My stomach tightened. Not from fear. From uncertainty. Whatever she wanted to tell me had clearly been weighing on her. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened the front door before she could knock. She stood there holding a cardboard tray with 2 coffees. A familiar peace offering. The same thing she had done before difficult conversations since she was 16.
Grandma. Sweetheart.
For a moment neither of us moved. Then I pulled her into a hug. She hugged me back immediately. Tightly. As though she had been waiting for permission. That alone told me something was wrong. We settled in the kitchen. The rain tapped softly against the windows. Steam rose from our coffee cups. For several minutes we talked about ordinary things. Classes. Summer plans. Professor she disliked. A roommate who never cleaned the microwave. I let her talk. Because Sophie was like Thomas in one important way. She approached difficult truths sideways. Never directly. Eventually she set down her coffee. Her fingers wrapped around the paper cup. Grandma. Yes. I'm sorry about Sunday. I smiled gently. We already talked about that. I know. She looked down. Then back up. But I don't think you understand why I'm apologizing. The room felt smaller suddenly. Not physically. Emotionally. I folded my hands together. What do you mean? Sophie took a breath. A deep one. Like someone preparing to jump into cold water. Mom has been treating you like that for a long time. There it was. The sentence neither of us had wanted to say. Yet both of us had been circling around. I looked out the window. Rainwater ran through the garden beds. The peonies bent beneath the weight of the weather. I know things haven't been perfect. No. Sophie's voice remained calm. That's not what I mean. Silence settled between us. Not hostile. Just honest. Finally I nodded. Then tell me what you mean. Sophie stared into her coffee. When I was little, I thought it was normal. I didn't interrupt. When I was maybe 10 or 11, Mom started making comments. What kind of comments? She hesitated. The hesitation hurt almost more than the answer. Because it meant she was trying to protect me. About how you talk to people. I swallowed. Go on. She'd say you were too friendly. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because being too friendly felt like a ridiculous crime. Sophie continued. At first it sounded harmless. Like she was joking. The rain intensified briefly. Neither of us spoke. Then Sophie said quietly. But after a while I realized she wasn't joking. I stared at the steam rising from my coffee. Memories were beginning to rearrange themselves. Like books being placed back onto the correct shelves. You noticed that when you were a child? I noticed a lot. The words opened something. And suddenly memories began surfacing. Not isolated moments. Patterns. I remembered Sophie's middle school choir concert. The auditorium had been packed. Afterward, everyone gathered in the lobby. Parents. Grandparents. Flowers. Photographs. Celebration. I remembered standing near the refreshments table waiting for Claire and Sophie. Waiting almost 20 minutes. Finally I found them. Crossed the building. Already taking family pictures. Without me. Claire had smiled when she saw me. Oh, there you are. Such an innocent sentence. At the time. Now it sounded different. Because she hadn't been looking for me. Not. Really. People search for things they want nearby. I remember the choir concert. The words slipped out before I meant to say them. Sophie's eyes widened slightly. Which one? 8th grade. The reaction on her face answered everything. She remembered too. Neither of us needed to explain. That frightened me, because it meant these weren't isolated incidents living only inside my imagination. Someone else had witnessed them. Someone else had been quietly keeping score. Grandma. Sophie's voice softened. I don't think Mom even realizes how much she does it anymore. I looked at her. What makes you think that? Because it's automatic now. The answer settled heavily in my chest. Automatic. That was somehow worse than deliberate cruelty. Deliberate cruelty required effort. Automatic cruelty meant it had become part of who you were. We sat quietly for several moments. Then Sophie surprised me. Can I tell you something that happened last year? Of course. She looked uncomfortable. More uncomfortable than before. Which immediately made me nervous. It was before my internship. I nodded. I was having lunch with Mom. The memory clearly bothered her. We were talking about family. And Sophie looked down. When your name came up. She stopped. The silence stretched. I didn't rush her. Eventually she forced herself to continue. She said she worried about you embarrassing her around professional contacts. The words landed softly. Yet somehow they struck harder than Sunday's humiliation. Because Sunday had been public. This had been private. Unfiltered. A glimpse into what Claire said when I wasn't there. I stared at the kitchen table. At the faint scratch marks left by decades of meals and homework and holiday baking. What exactly did she say? Sophie looked miserable. I immediately regretted asking. But I needed to know. She said. Another pause. She said she loved you. That surprised me. Then Sophie continued. But that loving someone and wanting them around all the time weren't the same thing. For a moment neither of us spoke. Rainwater trickled down the glass. A clock ticked somewhere in the living room. I felt suddenly exhausted. Not angry. Not devastated. Just tired. The kind of tired that comes when a truth you've been carrying for years finally reveals its full weight. Thomas used to tell me something. Whenever Claire disappointed me. Whenever she forgot a birthday. Canceled plans. Acted selfishly. Made excuses. He would say, Margaret, stop listening to what she says and start watching what she does. I hated that advice. Not because it was wrong. Because it was right. And mothers often survive by believing words. Not evidence. I thought of Thomas then. Of all the conversations we'd had over 42 years. And for the first time I wondered how much he had seen that I hadn't. Sophie. Yeah. Did your grandfather ever talk to you about your mother? She looked surprised. A little. What did he say? A small sad smile appeared. He said she wanted approval more than anything. The exact words hit me like a physical shock. Because they were almost identical to something Thomas once told me. She wants the world to clap for her. For several seconds I couldn't breathe properly. Not because of the memory. Because suddenly I could hear Thomas saying it. As clearly as if he were standing in the room. Sophie noticed my expression. Grandma. I blinked. I'm okay. That wasn't entirely true. Something inside me was shifting. Slowly. Painfully. Like an old bone being reset. Because for years I had viewed Claire's behavior as temporary. Stress. Career pressure. Social climbing. Middle-age anxiety. But what if it wasn't temporary? What if the seeds had always been there? What if success had simply given them room to grow? Around noon the rain finally stopped. The clouds began breaking apart. Thin shafts of sunlight appeared across the yard. Sophie helped me wash coffee cups. A small ordinary task. Yet I found comfort in it. The way she handed me dishes. The way she dried them without being asked. The way she moved around the kitchen like someone who belonged there. Family shouldn't feel complicated. It shouldn't require strategy. It shouldn't leave people feeling smaller. Before leaving, Sophie paused near the front door. Grandma. Yes. Her expression became serious again. The seriousness I had seen Sunday at brunch. The seriousness that had started all of this. There was actually another reason I wanted to come. My heart slowed. I had almost forgotten. The text message. The unfinished warning. There's something I think you should know. What is it? Sophie hesitated. then glanced toward the living room as though checking whether someone else might hear. Even though we were alone, when she looked back at me, her face had changed. Not frightened, concerned. Mom and Dad have been arguing about money. A strange feeling passed through me. Recognition. The same feeling I'd had reading her text the night before. A puzzle piece moving closer to its proper place. I stayed quiet, letting her continue. They've been arguing for months. Months. Not weeks. Months. Something deep inside me tightened. The conversation at brunch suddenly returned. The strange tension. The forced smiles. The relief when I left. The guarded glances. All of it. Sophie lowered her voice. And Grandma. She swallowed. I heard Mom say something about you. The room seemed to hold its breath. What did she say? Sophie looked genuinely reluctant, as though speaking the words would make them more real. Finally she answered. She said everything would be fine once things were finalized.
Ist her.
Finalized. The word felt oddly familiar, like hearing a song you've forgotten but somehow still recognize. What things? Sophie shook her head. I don't know. Then she added quietly, but whatever it is. She looked directly into my eyes. I think it involves you. And for the first time since Mother's Day brunch, I felt something other than hurt. Not hope. Not fear. Suspicion. A quiet suspicion that perhaps the cruelty wasn't only about embarrassment. Perhaps there was something else beneath it. Something hidden. Something waiting. Something my daughter didn't want me to see. The word stayed with me long after Sophie left. Finalized. Such an ordinary word. The kind people use for paperwork. Contracts. Mortgages. Insurance forms. Retirement plans. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Yet for some reason I couldn't stop thinking about it. Everything would be fine once things were finalized. The sentence echoed in my mind while I stood at the kitchen window watching Sophie's car disappear down the street. The afternoon sun had finally broken through the clouds. Water still clung to the peony leaves. A robin hopped through the flower bed searching for worms. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had looked that morning. But something inside me had changed. Not completely. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough to make me stop accepting easy explanations. Enough to make me start paying attention. For most of my life I had assumed love meant trust. If someone I loved gave me an explanation, I believed it. If they said something was a misunderstanding, I accepted it. If they told me not to worry, I tried not to. That habit had served me well in many relationships. It had also blinded me in others. I thought about Thomas. About all the times he gently suggested I was too willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. You always assume good intentions. He used to smile when he said it, as though he admired it and worried about it at the same time. I finally understood why. That evening I pulled an old photo album from the bookshelf in the den. Not because I wanted nostalgia, because I wanted context. There is a difference. Nostalgia remembers feelings. Context remembers facts. I sat in Thomas's leather chair and opened the album. The pages smelled faintly of dust and aging paper. Claire's childhood, family vacations, school plays, birthday parties,
Ordinai moments.
I studied them carefully. Not the smiles, the details. Who stood beside whom? Who organized events? Who showed up? Who didn't? At some point I realized I wasn't looking for memories anymore. I was looking for patterns. That realization unsettled me, because patterns suggest intent, and intent changes everything. The next morning, I found myself driving to the cemetery. I hadn't planned to. My car simply seemed to know the route. The cemetery sat on the edge of town beneath a grove of old oak trees. Thomas had been gone 8 years. Some days it felt like 8 weeks. Other days it felt like another lifetime. I parked beside the familiar section and walked slowly along. The paved path. The grass had recently been cut. The scent reminded me of summer evenings when Claire was young, and Thomas mowed the lawn while she chased fireflies. Funny how grief works. A smell. A sound. A patch of sunlight. And suddenly you're 30 years in the past. I stopped in front of Thomas's headstone. Simple. Exactly the way he wanted.
No elaborate monument. No dramatic inscription.
Just his name. His dates. And beneath them, beloved husband, father, friend. I sat on the small bench nearby. For several minutes I said nothing. I never talked to Thomas out loud the way some widows do, but I often thought toward him, as though he might somehow hear the direction of my thoughts. I think I missed something, I finally whispered. The wind stirred softly through the trees. No answer. Just leaves moving. I think you've known that for years. A small laugh escaped me. Even now, I could imagine exactly how he would respond. Patiently. Without judgment. Margaret, look at what's happening. Not what you wish was happening. That had always been Thomas. Steady. Practical. Difficult to fool. On my way home, I stopped at a small diner near the highway. The kind of place Thomas loved. Red booths. Bottomless coffee. Waitresses who remembered regular customers. I slid into a booth by the window. The lunch crowd was light. Mostly retirees. A couple of truck drivers. A young mother trying to keep a toddler occupied with crayons. The waitress arrived carrying a coffee pot. Just you today? I smiled. Just me. That'll be easy. She refilled my cup. Simple kindness. Nothing more. Yet I found myself appreciating it. Perhaps because kindness had begun feeling unexpectedly rare. As I stirred cream into my coffee, my phone buzzed. Claire. My stomach tightened immediately. The reaction irritated me. Parents aren't supposed to dread hearing from their children. I answered anyway. Hello. Mom. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. Too cheerful. Like someone trying on a mood. How are you? The question felt strange coming from her. Not because she never asked. Because she rarely waited for the answer. I'm fine. Good. A pause. Then, I've been thinking. I waited. About Sunday. Something inside me straightened. Not hopeful. Alert.
I'm listening.
Another pause. Then Claire sighed. I think things got off on the wrong foot. Not an apology. I noticed immediately. Not I hurt you. Not I was wrong. Just things got off on the wrong foot. The passive voice had always been one of Claire's favorite hiding places. Problems simply appeared. Misunderstandings simply happened. Nobody caused them. Nobody owned them. I don't think Sunday started on the wrong foot, I said quietly. It ended on one. Silence. I imagined her blinking, surprised by the response. That wasn't how our conversations usually went. Normally I softened things. Smoothed edges. Changed subjects. Made her comfortable. This time I didn't. Mom. What? You know I love you. The sentence should have comforted me. Instead it made me tired. Because love had become Claire's answer to everything. Like a stamp she placed over difficult conversations. Case closed. Issue resolved. I know. Another pause. Then she shifted directions. So what are your plans this week? The transition was so abrupt it almost made me laugh. What do you mean? Anything interesting? No. Still gardening? Yes. Still painting? Sometimes. The conversation felt oddly mechanical, as though she were checking boxes. Then she asked, Have you spoken to Richard Hale lately? I froze. The name sounded vaguely familiar. Not immediately, but familiar. Like something stored in the back of a closet. No. Really? Her tone changed. Barely. But enough. I noticed. Should I have? Oh no. Too quickly. Just curious. There it was. The first real alarm bell. Claire rarely asked about specific people, especially not random people. Yet she sounded invested in the answer. Very invested. I sat back in the diner booth, watching rainwater residue dry on the parking lot outside. Why Richard? Nothing. Too fast again. Just making conversation. No, it wasn't. I knew Claire. I had known her for 48 years. And for the first time in my life I found myself listening to her the way Thomas used to. Not hearing words. Watching behavior. The conversation lasted another few minutes. Then, ended. I stared at my phone long after the call disconnected.
Richard Hale.
Where had I heard that name? The answer arrived 20 minutes later while I was driving home. A bank. First County Bank. Thomas's bank. The same bank he had used for decades. My hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Why would Claire ask about a banker? Why now? And why did she seem relieved when I said we hadn't spoken? That evening I pulled out an old file box from the den closet. The box contained paperwork I rarely touched. Tax records, insurance documents, property records, letters, receipts, the ordinary paperwork of an ordinary life. I spent nearly an hour sorting through folders. Most contained exactly what I expected. Nothing unusual. Then I found a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in Thomas's handwriting. I stared at it. The date in the corner was 9 years old. A year before he died. The sight of his handwriting instantly tightened my throat. I sat down slowly. The envelope remained unopened. Not because I was afraid. Because I suddenly remembered something. A conversation. Brief. Almost forgotten. Thomas had been sitting at this very dining room table. Stacks of paperwork spread around him. Estate planning. Wills. Trusts. The things responsible adults eventually organize. I remembered teasing him. You make it sound like you're 80. I'll thank myself later. You'll be dead later. Then you'll thank me. That had made him laugh. Then he became serious. Very serious. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. If anything ever happens to me, promise you'll ask questions. I frowned. What questions? Any questions? He smiled. Especially if something feels off. At the time I thought he was talking about investments, taxes, legal paperwork. Now I wasn't so sure. The memory lingered long after sunset. I placed the unopened envelope back inside the box. Not because I intended to ignore it. Because something told me I wasn't ready yet. The timing felt wrong. Incomplete. Like opening the final chapter of a mystery before reading the middle. I needed more information first. More truth. More context. At 8:17 that evening my phone buzzed again. A text from Sophie. Grandma? Yes, sweetheart. Can I ask you something? Of course. 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. Then returned. Finally. Has Mom ever talked to you about Grandpa's trust? I stared at the screen. The room suddenly seemed very quiet. Trust. There it was. The word. The thing lurking beneath all the others. The thing no one seemed willing to discuss directly. My heartbeat slowed. Not sped up. Slowed. The way it does when a puzzle finally reveals its outline. I typed carefully. No. Why? Several seconds passed. Long enough for concern to settle into my stomach. Then her response arrived. Because I overheard Mom and Dad arguing again. I waited. Another message appeared. Mom said she can't believe Grandpa made everything depend on you. I read the sentence once. Then again. And again. The grandfather clock in the living room ticked softly. Steady. Patient. The way Thomas had always been. I looked toward the darkened hallway. Toward the room where our photographs still hung. Toward the life we'd built together. Then back at the screen. Everything depend on you. For the first time the pieces began moving together. Mother's Day. The tension. The fake concern. The sudden interest in Richard Hale. The arguments about money. The word finalized. And now this. A cold realization settled quietly into my chest. Maybe Claire's treatment of me wasn't only about embarrassment. Maybe it wasn't only about social status. Maybe there was something else underneath all of it. Something Thomas had seen before he died. Something important enough to plan for. And for the first time since Mother's Day brunch, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I needed answers. I waited 3 days before calling Richard Hale. Not because I wasn't curious. Because I was. Painfully curious. But curiosity and readiness are not the same thing. For 3 days I carried Sophie's text messages around with me like stones in my pocket. Heavy. Impossible to ignore. Mom said she can't believe Grandpa made everything depend on you. The sentence followed me through grocery aisles. Through gardening. Through laundry. Through sleepless nights. Everywhere. And beneath it sat an even more unsettling thought. What exactly had Thomas done? Because my husband was not a dramatic man. He didn't play games. He didn't manipulate people from beyond the grave. If he had arranged something, he would have had a reason. A serious one. which meant the answer might be far more painful than I was prepared for. Thursday morning arrived warm and bright. The kind of May morning Thomas loved. Blue sky, gentle breeze, sunlight stretching across the kitchen floor. I stood at the sink drinking coffee while staring at the bird feeder outside. Two cardinals argued over seed. A squirrel waited beneath them like a patient thief. Ordinary life. Yet my stomach felt anything but ordinary. At 9:12 I picked up the phone. Before I could lose my nerve, the receptionist answered on the second ring. First County Bank. I swallowed. Hello. My name is Margaret Whitmore. A pause. Then, one moment, Mrs. Whitmore. Something about the immediate recognition unsettled me. A minute later another voice appeared. Older, measured, professional, yet unexpectedly warm. Margaret. I closed my eyes briefly.
Richard Hale.
Now I remembered him clearly. Tall, gray-haired, always impeccably dressed. He and Thomas had known each other for nearly 30 years. Not just banker and customer. Friends. The kind of friendship men often build without discussing emotions. Golf games, community boards, charity events, mutual respect. Hello, Richard. His voice softened. It's been too long. Yes. A pause. Then, how are you? The question sounded genuine. Not polite. Genuine. And for some reason that nearly undid me, because lately I had become accustomed to questions people didn't really want answered.
I'm all right.
It wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough. Richard waited, as though he sensed there was more. Eventually I said, I was hoping we could talk. Silence. Brief. Thoughtful. Then, about Thomas? My grip tightened on the phone. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. When he spoke again, something had changed. Not alarm. Not concern. Recognition. Almost as though he had been expecting this call for years. Why don't you come by tomorrow morning? The bank looked exactly the same. Red brick. White columns. Neatly trimmed landscaping. The same building Thomas and I had walked into dozens of times over the years. Mortgage papers. Retirement planning. College savings for Claire. Life milestones measured through paperwork. I parked near the entrance, then sat in the car for a moment, breathing, preparing. The strange thing about life-changing moments is that they rarely look dramatic from the outside. People imagine thunderstorms, explosive confrontations, raised voices, but often they happen on quiet Friday mornings beneath clear skies while someone waters flowers nearby. I finally stepped out. The glass doors opened automatically. Cool air greeted me. So did Richard. He was waiting, not behind his desk, in the lobby, as though this meeting mattered. Margaret. He extended both hands. The gesture felt personal rather than professional. I took them. It's good to see you. His smile carried sadness. Not pity. Sadness. The distinction mattered. A few minutes later we sat in a private office. Large windows overlooked the town square. Coffee sat untouched between us. Neither of us seemed interested in drinking it. Richard studied me carefully, the way doctors study x-rays. Not invasive. Observant. What made you call? I could have lied. Could have danced around it. Instead I surprised myself. I'm starting to think Thomas knew something. Richard became very still. The room seemed to grow quieter. Outside the window a delivery truck rolled past. Inside, neither of us moved. Finally he asked, what kind of something? I looked down at my hands. The same hands I'd stared at after Mother's Day brunch. Older now than they felt, yet somehow steadier. I think he knew Claire was changing. Richard exhaled slowly. Not surprise. Confirmation. That frightened me. Margaret. His voice remained gentle. Why do you believe that? I thought about Sophie. About Mother's Day. About the years of small humiliations. The forgotten invitations. The changed plans. The subtle exclusions. The constant feeling of being tolerated rather than wanted. Then I thought about Thomas. His warnings. His observations. His insistence that I pay attention. Because he had always paid attention. Even when I didn't. I think he saw things I refused to see. Richard leaned back. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he nodded. Once. Slowly. And my heart sank. Because I suddenly knew. Before he even spoke. I knew. He loved you very much. The statement caught me off guard. I blinked. Richard continued. In all the years I knew Thomas, there was never any doubt about that. The emotion rose unexpectedly. Sharp. Immediate. I looked away toward the window. Toward the square. Toward anything else. Because grief is strange. You can survive years without crying. Then one simple sentence breaks something open. He loved Claire too. Richard's voice remained calm. Very much. I nodded. Of course he did. Thomas adored his daughter. Even when she frustrated him. Even when they argued. Even when he worried about her priorities. He loved her. Completely. Then why do I feel like we're about to discuss something terrible? The question escaped before I could stop it. Richard sighed. Not dramatically. Wearily. Like a man carrying knowledge for too long. Because we're about to discuss something difficult. The room grew still again. He opened a file drawer beside his desk. Pulled out a thick folder. Set it on the table between us. My name was written across the front. Margaret Whitmore. The sight of it made my pulse quicken. Richard rested one hand on the folder. But didn't open it immediately. Almost as though he wanted to give me one final opportunity to remain ignorant. Thomas updated his estate plan several times before he died. I nodded. That much I knew. During the final year of his illness, he made additional changes. Something tightened in my chest. Additional changes. The words felt important. Dangerous. Why? Richard looked directly at me. Because he became concerned. The room disappeared. Not literally, but emotionally. Everything narrowed. Richard. The folder. The sound of my own breathing. Nothing else. Concerned about what? He hesitated. Not because he lacked the answer. Because he disliked giving it. Claire. I stared at him. Part of me had expected the word. Part of me still wasn't prepared to hear it. Explain. Richard folded his hands. Thomas noticed certain patterns. Patterns. The same word I had begun using myself. My stomach dropped. He noticed increasing entitlement. I flinched. He noticed pressure. Pressure. He noticed that financial conversations became less about family and more about expectations. The office felt smaller, warmer, harder to breathe in. Because none of it sounded impossible. That was the problem. It sounded believable. Painfully believable. He never stopped loving her. Richard said it immediately, as though reading my thoughts. He never intended to punish her. The tears threatened then. Not because Claire was being criticized. Because Thomas had spent his final year worrying about something while I remained blind to it. How lonely that must have been. How frightening. Watching someone you love change. Knowing the people around you don't fully see it. What exactly did he do? My voice sounded distant. Richard finally opened the folder. Documents. Signatures. Legal language. Pages upon pages. Yet one phrase immediately stood out. The Whitmore Family Trust. Trust. The word Sophie had mentioned. The word Claire seemed so concerned about. The word sitting quietly beneath everything. Richard slid one page toward me. There are several provisions. I barely heard him. My eyes remained fixed on the document. One of them directly concerns your care and well-being. The air seemed to leave my lungs. My care. Yes. I looked up. Confused. Completely confused. Richard nodded. Thomas wanted to ensure you would never become financially vulnerable after his death. That sounded exactly like Thomas. Practical. Protective. Loving. Nothing surprising. Then Richard added. He also wanted to ensure that anyone benefiting from the trust treated you with dignity. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Dignity. Not obedience. Not loyalty. Dignity. I stared at him, unable to speak, because suddenly Mother's Day brunch flashed through my mind. You embarrass us. She ruins every room she walks into. The relief when I left. The years of exclusion. The years of explanations. The years of excuses. Dignity. No, there had been very little dignity in any of it. Richard's expression softened. Thomas was very specific. I swallowed. What does that mean? The answer came quietly, carefully, yet it changed everything. It means portions of the trust were structured around your well-being. My pulse quickened. Not because of money. The money barely registered. Something else did. The reason. The intention. The fact that Thomas had seen enough to act. Enough to build protections. Enough to worry. Enough to prepare. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Outside, sunlight reflected off passing cars. Inside, my entire understanding of the last 8 years began shifting. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. Enough to reveal a frightening possibility. Maybe Mother's Day wasn't an isolated cruelty. Maybe Sophie's concerns weren't exaggerated. Maybe Thomas hadn't been overly cautious. Maybe the truth had been sitting beside me all along. Waiting. Patiently. For me to finally look at it. Richard closed the folder gently. Not hiding it. Simply pausing. Giving me room to breathe. Because he could see I needed it. And sitting in that quiet office on a bright Friday morning, I realized something that hurt almost as much as Claire's betrayal. The person who had understood exactly what was happening had been gone for 8 years. I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes after leaving the bank. The engine wasn't running. The radio was off. The folder Richard had given me rested on the passenger seat beside my purse. I hadn't opened it again. Not because I didn't want to, because I couldn't. Not yet. Some truths arrive like lightning. Others arrive like winter. Slowly. Relentlessly. Seeping into everything. This felt like winter. I stared through the windshield at the town square. A young mother pushed a stroller past the fountain. 2 men in work uniforms carried boxes into a storefront. A teenager crossed the street holding an iced coffee and staring at her phone. Ordinary life. Meanwhile, my understanding of the past 8 years was quietly rearranging itself. Thomas had known. Not everything. Not the future. But enough. Enough to worry. Enough to act. Enough to create protections around me. The realization should have made me angry. Instead, it made me unbearably sad. Because I kept imagining him carrying that concern alone. Watching Claire change. Hoping she would correct herself. Waiting for signs that she wouldn't. And finally deciding he couldn't leave things entirely to chance. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel. For the first time in years, I wished desperately that I could ask him one simple question. How long had you known? The drive home felt different than the drive back from Mother's Day brunch. That day I had driven home hurt. Today I drove home awake. There is a difference. Pain clouds things. Awareness sharpens them. The neighborhood looked unchanged when I turned onto my street. Mrs. Donnelly's roses were beginning to bloom. The Johnson boys were playing basketball in their driveway. A delivery truck sat outside the Wilsons' house. Everything exactly as it should be. Yet I felt like someone returning from a distant country, seeing familiar things through unfamiliar eyes. Inside, the house greeted me with its usual quiet. I set the folder on the dining room table, then walked straight into the kitchen. Not because I was hungry, because I needed something normal, something manageable. I filled the kettle, waited for it to boil. Made tea. The ritual helped. Thomas always claimed tea was my solution to every crisis. Broken furnace? There. Bad news? There. Family argument? There. He wasn't entirely wrong. Some people reach for answers. I reached for routine. The kettle whistled softly. Steam rose into the afternoon sunlight. I carried the mug to the dining room and sat across from the folder. For several minutes, neither of us moved. Then I laughed quietly. A ridiculous image. A 70-year-old woman staring down a stack of legal documents as though it might attack. Eventually I opened it. Most of the language was exactly what I expected. Trust provisions. Financial arrangements. Legal definitions. Paragraphs requiring more patience than intelligence. But Richard had marked several pages with yellow tabs. The first explained how certain distributions would occur. The second detailed responsibilities of trustees. The third contained a handwritten note. Not from Richard. From Thomas. My breath caught immediately. The handwriting was unmistakable. Firm. Neat. Deliberate. The handwriting that filled birthday cards. Grocery lists. Notes left beside my coffee cup. I reached for the paper. My hands trembled slightly. Not from age. From memory. The note was short. Very short. Typical Thomas. Never a man of unnecessary words. If you're reading this, it means Richard thought you needed context. I swallowed hard. The words blurred briefly. I blinked. Continued. Margaret, I trust your judgment more than anyone's. If something feels wrong, don't explain it away. Pay attention. Ask questions. And remember that being kind does not require being blind. I stared at the note for a long time. Being kind does not require being blind. The sentence felt less like advice, more like a gentle correction. A correction 8 years too late. My phone rang. The sound startled me badly enough that I nearly spilled tea on the paperwork. Claire. For a moment I simply stared at her name. Then I answered. Hello. Mom. Her voice sounded unusually bright. Again. The same forced brightness from earlier in the week. I'm just checking in. Checking in. Interesting phrase. Not calling because she missed me. Not calling because she was worried. Checking in. Like someone monitoring a situation. How are you?
I'm all right.
Good. A pause followed. Then. What are you doing today? I looked down at Thomas's note. The timing almost made me smile. Just reading. What are you reading? There it was. The first real question. Specific. Interested. I suddenly remembered something Richard had said. Thomas noticed increasing pressure. Pressure. Not demands. Pressure. Subtle. Persistent. Harder to identify. An old file, I replied. Silence. Very brief. Very revealing. Oh. Hum. What kind of file? I took a sip of tea. Made her wait. For once. Family paperwork. Another pause. Longer this time. Interesting. Very interesting. Claire recovered quickly. She always did. So anyway, I wanted to talk to you about something. Of course she did. The real reason for the call had finally arrived. I leaned back in my chair. I'm listening. Her tone softened. Almost affectionate. The change would have impressed me if I hadn't spent 48 years listening to her. Daniel and I have been worried. I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny. Because whenever someone begins a sentence with "we've been worried," they are rarely about to discuss your actual well-being. What about? You've seemed isolated lately. There it was. Concern. Packaged. Polished. Presented like a gift. I looked around the room. The carnations from Mother's Day still sat in their vase, though several petals had begun curling at the edges. Funny. Flowers tell the truth eventually, no matter how carefully they're arranged. I'm not isolated. Mom. The tone carried gentle disapproval. The same tone she used when correcting restaurant servers. Or interns. Or people she considered difficult. You spend most of your time alone. Many widows do. That's not healthy. I stared out the window. A squirrel darted across the yard. Free. Unconcerned. Unmanaged. I have friends. I know. The answer came too quickly, as though she hadn't actually considered it. Then Claire arrived at the real topic. The thing she'd been building toward. I've been thinking maybe it's time we discussed the house. There it was. My fingers tightened slightly around the mug. The house. The same house she'd shown little interest in maintaining. Little interest in visiting. Little interest in helping me care for. Until now. What about it? You've been here alone a long time. 8 years. She meant 8 years. But somehow saying it aloud would make her sound impatient. So she left it vague. Professional. Reasonable. You know, she continued. There are wonderful condo communities now. I closed my eyes briefly. Condo communities. Interesting. Not assisted living. Not nursing care. Luxury downsizing. The sort of suggestion that sounds thoughtful. Responsible. Modern. Until you examine who benefits. Claire. Yes. Do you want me to move? Silence. Not shock. Calculation. I could almost hear it. The careful search for the correct answer. That's not what I said. Of course it wasn't. She was too smart for that. Too polished. Too practiced. No. She laughed lightly. I just think you deserve an easier life. There it was again. The language of concern. The language that hides other motives. The language Thomas had apparently noticed years before I did. We talked another 10 minutes. Or rather, Claire talked. About amenities. Convenience. Maintenance-free living. Walkable communities. Active senior lifestyles. Every point sounded perfectly reasonable. That was the genius of it. The best manipulation rarely sounds unreasonable. Sounds helpful. I listened quietly. Asked almost no questions. The less I said, the more she revealed. Eventually she finished. So think about it. I will. Really? Her surprise slipped through before she could hide it. That tiny reaction told me more than the entire conversation. She had expected resistance. Prepared for resistance. What she wasn't prepared for was observation. After we hung up, I sat in silence. Then I opened Thomas's note again. Being kind does not require being blind. The sentence felt different now. Sharper. Clearer. Almost alive. For years, I had mistaken peacekeeping for wisdom. Perhaps they weren't the same thing. Saturday afternoon brought another visitor. Sophie. She arrived carrying iced coffees and a paper bag from the bakery. I brought lemon bars. I smiled. You know exactly how to get invited in. She laughed. A genuine laugh. One of the few sounds lately that didn't carry tension beneath it. We settled on the back patio. The weather had finally turned beautiful. Birds moved through the maple tree. A breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass from somewhere nearby. For a while we talked about ordinary things. Then Sophie grew quiet. I recognized the shift immediately. What's wrong? She stared into her iced coffee. Mom and Dad had another fight. The words didn't surprise me anymore. That worried me. What happened? Sophie hesitated. Then sighed. It was about money again. I said nothing, letting her continue. They thought I was upstairs. Her voice dropped slightly. But I heard Mom say something. My pulse slowed. That same feeling again. Puzzle pieces moving. What? Sophie looked uncomfortable. The way people look. When they dislike repeating something cruel. She said she can't keep waiting forever. The words landed softly. Yet they echoed. Waiting forever. Waiting for what? I already knew the answer. Or at least part of it. Still, hearing it aloud hurt. Because suddenly Mother's Day looked different. The years of exclusion looked different. The fake concern looked different. Everything looked different. What did your father say? Sophie stared toward the garden. He told her to stop talking like that. I felt an unexpected flicker of relief. Small. But real. And then he asked if she'd forgotten you're his mother. The sentence settled warmly inside me. Not enough to erase anything, but enough to matter. Sometimes people show their character in grand gestures. More often they show it in small objections nobody notices. The afternoon sun stretched across the patio. Long shadows reaching through the yard. Sophie set down her cup, then looked directly at me. Grandma. Yes. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think Mom actually loves you? The question shocked me. Not because I hadn't wondered. Because hearing it from Sophie felt unbearably sad. I thought carefully before answering. Very carefully. Because the wrong answer could damage something fragile. Finally I said, yes. Sophie frowned. Then why does she treat you like this? I looked toward the house. Toward the windows reflecting sunlight. Toward decades of memories. Then I answered honestly. Because love and character aren't always the same thing. She absorbed that quietly. So did I. Because it was the first time I'd ever admitted it aloud. Claire loved me. I believed that. But somewhere along the way, she had also begun seeing me as an obstacle. A responsibility. Problem to solve. And perhaps something else. Something connected to money. To waiting. To plans she wanted finalized. Plans I still didn't fully understand. Yet. But sitting beside Sophie in the fading afternoon light, I realized the truth was getting closer. And for the first time I wasn't afraid to find it. The invitation arrived 4 days later. Not by mail. Not by email. Claire brought it herself. Which immediately made me suspicious. My daughter had spent years perfecting efficiency. She paid bills online, ordered groceries through apps, and sent birthday reminders from her phone. If she drove 20 minutes across town to hand-deliver an envelope, there was a reason. I was deadheading roses in the backyard when her silver Lexus pulled into the driveway. The sight of it made me pause. Not because I wasn't happy to see her, because I had started paying attention. There is a difference. I set down my gardening shears and wiped my hands on my jeans as Claire stepped out of the car. She looked beautiful. She always did. Cream-colored blouse, tailored slacks, gold earrings, hair perfectly styled despite the humid afternoon. My daughter had become the kind of woman magazine editors called effortless. The effort, of course, was enormous. "Mom." She smiled warmly as she approached. A little too warmly. "Claire." We hugged. Briefly. Politely. The way distant relatives hug at weddings. Not the way mothers and daughters should. For a second I thought she noticed it too. Then the moment passed. I hope I'm not interrupting. I glanced at the half-trimmed rose bush. Nothing important. Her eyes flicked around the yard, the garden, the porch, the flower beds, the old colonial house behind us. Evaluating. The realization arrived so quickly it almost startled me. Claire wasn't looking at the property the way a daughter visits her mother's home. She was looking at it the way someone evaluates an asset. I hated myself for thinking it. Then I remembered Thomas's note. Pay attention. So I did. We sat on the porch with iced tea. The afternoon sun filtered through the maple tree. A lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. For a few minutes the conversation stayed pleasantly superficial. The weather. Sophie's summer classes. The roses. Then Claire reached into her purse. There it was. A cream-colored envelope. Heavy paper. Expensive. Formal. She handed it to me with a smile. "I wanted you to have this personally." I looked at the envelope, then at her. "What is it?" "The Hamilton Art Museum Gala." I raised an eyebrow. Claire laughed lightly. "Don't look so alarmed." I opened the envelope. Inside was an embossed invitation. The annual Hamilton Foundation Gala. One of the largest charity events in the county. Black tie. Donors. Executives. Board members. The kind of event Claire loved. The kind of event Thomas spent most of his life politely avoiding. I read the details twice, then looked up. "You want me to attend?" "Of course." The answer came immediately. Too immediately. I studied her face. Years ago, I would have accepted the invitation without question. Now I found myself asking something different. "Why?" The silence stretched just long enough for Claire to notice. Her smile faltered slightly. "What?" I folded the invitation. "Why now?" A flicker appeared in her eyes. Gone almost instantly. But not before I saw it.
Surprise.
Perhaps she wasn't accustomed to being questioned. "Because you're my mother." I waited. She waited. Finally she sighed. "Mom." "What?" "Do we have to analyze everything lately?" "Interesting." Not deny it. Redirect it. A familiar strategy. I took a sip of tea. "No." "Then come." Her tone softened. It would mean a lot. There it was. The emotional appeal. I almost admired the craftsmanship. That night after Claire left, I found myself standing in front of my closet. The gala was still 10 days away. Yet I was already thinking about it. Not because I enjoyed charity events. I never had. Thomas and I attended our share over the years. Fundraisers. Auctions. Museum dinners. Necessary social obligations. Nothing more. But this invitation felt different. Purposeful. Like a move in a game I didn't fully understand yet. The thought should have discouraged me. Instead it made me curious. And curiosity had become a dangerous thing lately. 3 days before the gala, Richard Hale called. Not unexpectedly. We had spoken twice since my visit. Each conversation revealing a little more. Never enough to overwhelm me. Just enough to help me see. "Margaret." "Hello, Richard. How are you holding up?" I smiled. The question sounded sincere. "Still. Better than I was. I suspected you might be." His voice carried gentle amusement. Then he became serious. "I wanted to ask something." "All right. Has Claire contacted you recently?" The question immediately sharpened my attention. "Yes." A pause. Then, "More than usual?" I laughed quietly. Considerably more. Silence. Then, I thought so. I stared out the kitchen window. The bird feeder swayed gently in the breeze. Richard. Yes. Why does everyone seem to know what's happening except me? His answer came softly. Because you're only now allowing yourself to see it. The truth of that hurt. Because it was true. The night of the gala arrived warm and clear. I almost didn't go. Twice. Once while putting on makeup. Again while fastening my earrings. But each time I remembered Thomas. And Sophie. And Richard. And every small moment I'd spent pretending not to notice what was happening. No. This time I would show up. I would observe. I would pay attention. Nothing more. Nothing less. I chose a navy blue evening dress. Simple. Elegant. The same dress I'd worn to Sophie's scholarship ceremony. Then I opened my jewelry box. Inside sat a pair of pearl earrings. Thomas's gift for our 40th anniversary. I held them for a long moment, then put them on. For courage. Not vanity. The Hamilton Museum glowed with light. Valets moved efficiently through the circular driveway. Guests stepped from luxury cars in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. The entire evening smelled faintly of expensive perfume and fresh flowers. Claire and Daniel were already waiting inside. When Claire saw me, something crossed her face. Relief. Not affection. Relief. Another detail. Another clue. Mom. She kissed my cheek. You look beautiful. I thanked her. The compliment sounded genuine. That surprised me. Perhaps because genuine moments had become increasingly rare between us. Daniel greeted me warmly. Warmer than usual. He looked tired. I noticed that immediately. The smile. The eyes. The tension around his jaw. People carrying financial stress often wear it physically long before they admit it. Thomas used to. Now Daniel did. The ballroom was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers. White linens. Fresh orchids. Hundreds of guests. A string quartet performed near the stage. The room radiated wealth. Yet something unexpected happened almost immediately. People recognized me. Not Claire. Me. The first was an older woman named Eleanor. Former board member. Retired philanthropist. I hadn't seen her in years. Margaret Whitmore? She clasped my hands warmly. My goodness. We spoke for several minutes. Then she smiled. I still remember what you and Thomas did for the Children's Literacy Fund. Claire blinked. What literacy fund? Eleanor looked surprised. You don't know. I noticed Claire stiffen. Slightly. Almost imperceptibly. But enough. Eleanor continued. Your parents funded half the original program. Silence. Claire stared at me. I never knew that. No reason you would. The answer slipped out naturally. Thomas and I had never advertised our charity work. That wasn't how we were raised. You helped because help was needed. Not because someone might applaud. The evening continued. And it kept happening. Again. And again. And again. People approached. Old colleagues. Former trustees. Community leaders. Retired educators. Everywhere I turned, someone remembered Thomas and me. Not for money. For character. For generosity. For reliability. For quiet acts nobody posted online. Nobody publicized. Nobody celebrated. One conversation in particular stayed with me. An elderly gentleman introduced himself as Judge Samuel Whitaker. Retired now. Sharp-eyed despite his age. He smiled warmly. Your husband saved my campaign 20 years ago. I frowned. I don't remember that. Of course you don't. He laughed. Because he never told anyone. The judge looked around the ballroom. Then added. That's what made him different. The word struck me harder than he could have known. Because suddenly I saw Claire watching from across the room. And for the first time all evening she looked unsettled. Not angry. Unsettled. As though the narrative she built about me wasn't matching reality. Near dessert, another strange thing happened. A board member approached our table. A wealthy donor named Harold Morrison. He greeted Claire politely. Daniel politely. Then turned directly toward me. Mrs. Whitmore. I smiled. Please call me Margaret. Margaret. He lowered his voice. Your husband was one of the smartest men I ever worked with. Something flickered. Across Claire's face. Harold continued. He always thought 3 moves ahead. 3 moves ahead. The phrase landed heavily, because I suddenly thought of the trust. Of Richard. Of protections. Of plans. Of concern. Of Thomas. Always watching. Always noticing. Always preparing. Later, while guests mingled near the museum terrace, Claire found me alone. Her expression was carefully composed, but I could see the tension beneath it now. What a night. Yes. She folded her arms. People seem very eager to talk about Dad. I smiled gently. They loved him. A pause. Then, they talk about you too. Interesting. Not admiration. Not pride. Observation. I turned toward her. The museum lights reflected softly in the windows behind us. What does that bother you? Her eyes widened slightly. Again. A reaction she hadn't intended. No. Too fast. The same way she'd answered questions about Richard Hale. The same way she'd answered questions about the house. Too fast. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then someone across the room called my name. Another former trustee. Another old friend. Another person who remembered a version of me Claire seemed surprised existed. As I walked away I glanced back once. Claire stood alone near the terrace. Watching. Thinking. Calculating. And for the first time since Mother's Day brunch, I realized something important. My daughter wasn't worried because I was embarrassing. She wasn't worried because I talked to strangers. She wasn't worried because I was old. She was worried because people were starting to see me clearly. And somehow, that threatened something she desperately wanted to keep under control. I didn't realize how tense Claire had become until the ride home. The gala ended just after 10. The final speeches concluded. The auction numbers were announced. Guests drifted toward the exits carrying gift bags and exchanging business cards. Everything looked successful. Elegant. Perfect. Exactly the kind of evening Claire usually loved. Yet as Daniel pulled the car away from the museum, an uncomfortable silence settled inside the vehicle. I sat in the back seat. Claire occupied the passenger seat. Daniel drove. Streetlights slid. Crossed the windows. No one spoke. First I assumed everyone was tired. Then I noticed Claire checking her phone. Again. And again. And again. Not texting. Reading. Waiting. Her jaw remained tight. Her shoulders rigid. Something about the evening had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. The realization sat quietly in my chest. Not satisfying. Not triumphant. Just revealing. For years, I had watched my daughter move through rooms with effortless confidence. Tonight for the first time she looked uncertain. Daniel eventually broke the silence. People were happy to see you tonight, Margaret. I looked up. The use of my first name surprised me. Normally he called me Mom. The change wasn't disrespectful. If anything, it sounded more honest. Less automatic. That's kind of you to say. It's true. His eyes remained on the road. I didn't realize how many community projects you and Tom were involved in. Neither had Claire. That much was obvious. I caught her reflection in the passenger side window. She stared straight ahead. Not contributing. Not disagreeing. Just listening. The same way someone listens when a conversation is drifting toward dangerous territory. When we arrived at my house, Daniel parked in the driveway. I reached for the door handle, then paused, because something felt unfinished. The evening had revealed something. Not facts. Not documents. Something deeper. A shift. Crack. A weakening of whatever story Claire had been telling herself. I couldn't quite name it yet, but I felt it. Thank you for the ride. Daniel smiled. Of course. I stepped out. The night air felt cool against my skin. The porch light glowed softly above the front door. For a second I thought that would be the end of it. Then Claire called after me. Mom. I turned. She was already out of the car. Standing beside the driveway. The museum lights were long gone now. No the owners. No board members. No audience. Just us. That felt important. Can we talk for a minute? Daniel remained in the driver's seat. Looking forward. Not interfering. Not leaving. A man caught between two loyalties. I suddenly felt sorry for him. Not because he was blameless, because he looked exhausted. Claire crossed her arms, then uncrossed them, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. The sight almost made me smile. Almost. What is it? She hesitated. That alone was unusual. Claire rarely hesitated. She preferred certainty, control, prepared remarks. Tonight she seemed to be searching for footing. Some of the things people said tonight. I waited. She glanced away, then back. They surprised me. There it was. Not the full truth, but closer. How so? Another pause. People talked about you like. She stopped. I said nothing. Eventually she finished. Like you're someone important. The sentence hung in the air between us. For a second I wondered if she realized how painful it sounded. Apparently not. Because she kept talking. I mean, I know you're respected. That's not what I mean. No. It was exactly what she meant. The old version of me would have rushed to rescue her. To soften the moment. To explain. To protect her from her own words. Instead I waited. The silence did the work for me. Claire shifted uncomfortably. Finally she sighed. You know what I'm trying to say. I don't think I do. The answer came calmly. No anger. No accusation. Just truth. That seemed to unsettle her even more. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The neighborhood remained quiet. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Wind moved softly through the maple tree. Then Claire asked a question that surprised me. When was the last time you talked to Richard Hale? There it was. Again. Richard. Not grief. Not Mother's Day. Not the years of hurt. Richard. I felt something cold settle inside me, because suddenly I understood. Not everything, but enough. Enough to see where her attention kept returning. Enough to see what worried her. Enough to see what didn't. I saw him recently. The answer landed like a stone. Claire froze. Not visibly. Most people wouldn't have noticed. I did. When? The question came too quickly. Much too quickly. And for the first time in my life, I heard greed hiding beneath my daughter's voice. Not greed for luxury. Not greed for status. Something more desperate. Fear disguised as concern. I looked at her quietly. Why does that matter? Silence. Real silence this time. The kind that arrives when someone loses control of a conversation. For years, Claire had guided discussions wherever she wanted them to go. Now she couldn't. And she hated it. Mom. Her tone softened. Careful. Measured. I just think there are things you don't fully understand. I nearly laughed. Not because it was amusing. Because Richard had said almost the same thing. The difference was fascinating. Richard wanted me informed. Claire wanted me dependent. The contrast had never been clearer. Then explain them. Another pause. Longer this time. She looked toward the house. Toward the windows. Anywhere except my face. Then she shook her head. It's complicated. Of course it was. Complicated had become the family word for conversations nobody wanted to have honestly. Something inside me finally clicked. Not a revelation. A recognition. For years I had viewed Claire's behavior as a collection of separate incidents. The missed invitations. The humiliations. The exclusions. The condescension. The constant management. Now I saw the common thread. Control. Not hatred. Not even cruelty exactly. Control. She needed to be the competent one. The successful one. The knowledgeable one. The person who understood how everything worked. And if I remained independent, if I remained respected, if I remained capable, then her position felt less secure. The realization hurt, but it also explained so much. Can I ask you something? Claire nodded cautiously. When did you start thinking I couldn't manage my own life? The question hit harder than I intended. Her face changed immediately. Defensiveness. Hurt. Maybe even guilt. That's not fair. I waited. She continued. I don't think that. No. No. The answer arrived instantly, then weakened. Not exactly. There it was. Closer. Closer than she'd been all year. I looked at my daughter. Really looked at her. The expensive gown. The carefully maintained appearance. The exhaustion beneath her eyes. And suddenly I realized something else. She wasn't winning. Whatever she had been chasing, whatever future she had imagined, whatever pressure she was carrying, it wasn't making her happy. It was consuming her. That didn't excuse anything. But it mattered. Because villains rarely think of themselves as villains. Most people simply convince themselves they're doing what's necessary. Claire. My voice softened. Not because she deserved comfort. Because I was tired of anger. What are you afraid of? The question struck her harder than any accusation could have. I saw it happen. The slight widening of her eyes. The brief loss of composure. The instinctive retreat. Fear. Not guilt. Fear. For one impossible second I thought she might actually answer. I thought she might tell the truth. Instead she looked away. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course. The door closed again. The mask returned. The moment passed. But not before I saw what lived underneath. And once you've seen something clearly, you can't unsee it. Daniel finally opened his door and stepped out. Not aggressively. Not defensively. Just tired. Very tired. He walked over slowly. Everything all right? The question sounded genuine. No one answered immediately. Because all three of us knew the answer. No. Nothing was all right. Not really. The difference was that only one of us seemed willing to admit it. Daniel looked between us. Then at Claire. Something moved across his face. Recognition. Perhaps he had reached the same conclusion I had. Perhaps much earlier. Maybe we should head home. Claire nodded immediately. Too quickly. Grateful for the escape. That told me more than anything else. She turned toward the car. Then stopped. For a second she remained standing there. Her back to me. The porch light casting a long shadow across the driveway. Without turning around she spoke. Mom. Yes. Her voice sounded smaller than usual. Almost young. Almost vulnerable. I never wanted things to get complicated. The statement lingered in the darkness. Not an apology. Not accountability. Just regret. And perhaps that was the most she could offer right now. After they left, I stood alone in the driveway, watching the taillights disappear. The night felt very still. Very quiet. Very honest. When I finally went inside, I found myself stopping in front of the framed photograph of Thomas in the hallway. The one taken shortly before retirement. The one where he looked calm enough to survive anything. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I smiled sadly, because I finally understood something about my husband. He hadn't created the trust because he distrusted Claire. He created it because he understood human nature. He understood pressure, fear, entitlement, the slow erosion of character. Most importantly, he understood me. He knew I would keep making excuses long after the evidence became impossible to ignore. So he left breadcrumbs, protections, warnings. Not to punish our daughter, to protect her mother. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of my bed and opened the folder again. For the first time, I noticed a handwritten notation on one of the trust pages. A note Richard hadn't mentioned. A note written in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. Only 7 words. 7 words that made my heart stop. If circumstances change, tell Margaret everything. Everything. Not some things. Not enough. Everything. I stared at the note, then slowly closed the folder. Because suddenly I knew something with absolute certainty. Richard still wasn't telling me the whole story. And whatever remained hidden was big enough that Thomas had specifically planned for the day it would finally come out. The following Tuesday, Claire called just after noon. I was standing in the kitchen peeling peaches for a pie. The fruit had come from a roadside stand on the edge of town, and the entire room smelled faintly of sugar and summer. For a moment, I considered letting the call go to voicemail. Not because I was angry, because every conversation with Claire lately felt like stepping into deep water without knowing how far down it went. But eventually I wiped my hands on a dish towel and answered. Hello. Mom. Her voice sounded unusually controlled. Not warm. Not cold. Careful. I was wondering if I could stop by. The request immediately caught my attention. Claire rarely stopped by without a reason. Of course. A pause. Then, I'd like to talk. There it was. Not visit. Not check on me. Talk. Something had changed. I felt it instantly. All right. I'll be there around 2. The line. Disconnected. No small talk. No explanation. Just certainty. I stood in the kitchen for several seconds staring at the phone. Then I returned to my peaches. Because regardless of what was coming, people still needed to eat. Thomas used to say that pie was my preferred method of handling emotional crises. Perhaps he was right. At exactly 1:58, Claire's car pulled into the driveway. Punctual. Always punctual. Some habits survive everything. I watched through the kitchen window as she stepped out carrying nothing.
No flowers. And no gift bag.
No folder. That interested me. Because for once she hadn't arrived with props. Only herself. The realization made me unexpectedly nervous. When she entered the house, she paused near the doorway. Looking around. Not evaluating. Not this time. Remembering. The difference was subtle. But real. For a moment she looked less like the polished executive from the gala, and more like the teenager who used to race upstairs dropping her backpack in the hallway. Then the moment vanished. Something smells good. Beach bien. A faint smile touched her face. Dad's favorite. The mention of Thomas hung between us. Neither of us immediately commented on it. Instead, I returned to rolling pie dough while Claire settled onto one of the kitchen stools. The same stool she'd done homework at. The same stool where she'd cried after her first heartbreak. The same stool where Thomas taught her how to balance a checkbook. Life leaves ghosts in kitchens. More than any other room. For several minutes neither of us mentioned why she was there. The silence wasn't hostile. Just cautious. Like two people approaching a damaged bridge and trying to decide whether it will hold. Finally Claire spoke. Mom. I continued arranging peach slices. Yes. I know you've been talking to Richard. The knife stopped in my hand. Not dramatically. Just enough. There it was. The thing she'd been circling for weeks. The thing beneath every question. The thing beneath the gala. The thing beneath the house. The thing beneath Mother's Day. Richard. Or rather what Richard represented. Truth. I set the knife down. Then looked directly at her. Yes.
No denial. No deflection.
Just, yes. Claire exhaled slowly. The way people do when their fears become reality. What did he tell you? Interesting. Not. How are you feeling? Not. What did you learn? Not. Was it difficult? What did he tell you? The wording mattered. Everything mattered now. I wiped my hands on the dish towel. He told me about the trust. Silence. Heavy silence. Claire looked down at the countertop. Then back up. I suddenly noticed how tired she looked. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone carrying a weight she could no longer hide. How much did he tell you? The question sounded almost desperate. I thought about Thomas's note. If circumstances change, tell Margaret everything. Everything. Not some. Everything. He told me enough. The answer landed harder than I intended. Claire flinched. Only slightly. But enough. The kitchen grew quiet again. Outside, a lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically somewhere down the street. Inside, the pie crust waited unfinished between us. Eventually Claire spoke. I wish Dad hadn't done this. There it was. Not grief. Not guilt. Frustration. I studied her carefully. Done what? The trust. The words came quickly now, as though years of restraint had finally cracked. He made everything complicated. Everything. The same word Sophie had overheard. Everything depended on you. Everything would be fine once things were finalized. Everything. Apparently that word haunted more than one member of this family. I folded my arms. Did he? The question surprised her. Clearly she expected agreement. Not curiosity. What do you mean? What exactly did he complicate? For a moment she couldn't answer. That told me more than the answer itself. Because people usually struggle when they're describing consequences instead of causes. Claire stood and walked toward the sink. A familiar habit from childhood. Whenever she felt cornered, she needed movement. Needed space. Needed something to do with her hands. You don't understand. The phrase no longer had power over me. Not after Richard. Not after Sophie. Not after Thomas's notes. Then help me understand. She laughed. A short humorless laugh. You make it sound so simple. No. I shook my head gently. I think you're making it sound complicated. That stopped her. Completely. For several seconds we simply looked at each other. Mother. Daughter. Two women who loved each other. Two women who no longer trusted each other. The realization hurt more than I expected. Because distrust doesn't arrive overnight. It arrives one disappointment at a time. One omission at a time. One manipulation at a time. Until eventually it settles into the relationship like dust. Quiet. Persistent. Everywhere. Claire finally sat down again. Her shoulders slumped slightly. The fight seemed to leave her all at once. What did Richard tell you about me? There it was. The real question. Not money. Not legal documents. Her. I considered the answer carefully, because this moment mattered. He told me your father was worried. Her eyes closed briefly. Just briefly. When they opened again, they looked shinier than before. Not tears. Close. Worried. She repeated the word softly, almost bitterly. That's one way to put it. I said nothing, letting her continue. For once, she didn't seem interested in controlling the conversation. She seemed tired of controlling it. He never trusted me. The statement hit me like a slap. Because it wasn't true. Not even close. I knew it instantly. That's not true. It is. No. The answer came firmly. Stronger than anything I'd said all afternoon. Claire looked surprised. So was I. He adored you. Silence. He believed in you. More silence. He worried about you. I paused. Those aren't the same thing. Something shifted in her expression. Not acceptance. Recognition. The kind that hurts. Because deep down she already knew. Thomas hadn't distrusted her. He'd seen her clearly. And perhaps that was worse. For a while neither of us spoke. The pie remained unfinished. The peaches slowly darkened in the bowl. A clock ticked in the hallway. Life continuing around us. Patient. Uninterested in family drama. Finally I asked the question that had been waiting for weeks. The question at the center of everything. Claire. Her eyes lifted. What? I held her gaze. And where exactly do I fit into all of this? The room went completely still. Because there it was. Not money. Not trusts. Not legal structures. Not inheritance. Me. The person supposedly at the center of everyone's concern. The person nobody seemed to actually discuss. Claire stared at me. Searching. Thinking. Looking for the correct answer. But for once there wasn't one. No polished explanation. No carefully crafted language. No corporate phrasing. Just truth. And truth had become unfamiliar territory. Finally she whispered. I don't know. The words barely reached me. Yet they struck harder than anything she'd said since Mother's Day. Because they were honest. Brutally. Painfully. Honest. I looked down at the pie dough. At the flour scattered across the countertop. And my own hands. Older hands. Steady hands. Hands that had spent 48 years making room for Claire. Protecting her. Supporting her. Believing in her. And for the first time I realized something. My daughter had built an entire future in her mind. A future involving money. Security. Status. Plans. Expectations. And somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten to leave room for me inside it. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. Simply gradually. One compromise at a time. One rationalization at a time. Until eventually I became a factor instead of a person. A variable instead of a mother. Claire stood abruptly. Tears finally gathering in her eyes. Not falling. Gathering. I never meant for that to happen. The sentence sounded real. More real than anything she'd said in months. Maybe years. I believed her. And somehow that made it worse. Because the deepest wounds are often caused by people who never intended to create them. Neither of us spoke again for a long time. The afternoon sunlight shifted across the kitchen floor. The pie remained unfinished. The conversation remained unfinished. Everything remained unfinished. But for the first time since Mother's Day brunch we had stopped pretending. And that, I realized, was where healing or destruction always begins. Claire left without taking any pie. That detail stayed with me. Not because pie mattered. because it was unusual. For as long as I could remember, Claire never left my house empty-handed. Cookies, leftovers, fresh tomatoes from the garden, a container of soup, something. Even during our worst disagreements, she would pause by the kitchen counter and say, "Can I take some of that with me?" Not that afternoon. That afternoon she walked out carrying only her purse and whatever thoughts were chasing her. I stood at the front door and watched her drive away. The same way I had watched her leave hundreds of times before. First day of kindergarten, college, her wedding, hospital visits after Sophie was born, holiday dinners, ordinary Tuesdays. Life had been a long series of watching Claire move farther away. The difference was that this time I finally noticed the distance. The house felt strangely quiet afterward. Not lonely, just reflective. Like a church after a service. The pie still sat unfinished on the kitchen counter. I looked at it for a moment, then laughed softly. Your daughter just dismantled 20 years of denial and you're worried about pie. Thomas would have found that amusing. Eventually I finished baking it. Because some things deserve completion, even when other things don't. That evening Sophie called. Not texted. Called. The sound of her voice immediately told me she was anxious. Grandma. Hello, sweetheart. Did Mom come by? News traveled fast in families, particularly families carrying secrets. She did. A pause. Then, was it bad? I considered the question carefully. No. Another pause. Was it good? I smiled. No. That made her laugh unexpectedly. The first genuine laugh I'd heard from her in days. That's not very helpful. I'm afraid it's the most honest answer I have. We talked for nearly an hour. Classes, summer plans, books she was reading, ordinary things. Neither of us wanted to spend the entire conversation discussing Claire. That felt important, because family problems have a way of consuming every room they enter. If you're not careful, they become the only thing anyone talks about, the only thing anyone sees. I didn't want that. Not for Sophie. Not for me. Not even for Claire. Before hanging up, Sophie became quiet, the way she always did when something important was coming. Grandma. Yes. I think Mom's scared. I looked toward the living room window. The evening sky was turning lavender. A few early stars had begun appearing. Why? Sophie sighed. Because things aren't going the way she expected. The answer lingered. Not because it was surprising, because it applied to more than money, more than the trust, more than inheritance. Life itself. Claire had spent decades believing hard work could control outcomes. Planning could control outcomes. Presentation could control outcomes. Then suddenly she had encountered something uncontrollable. Another human being. Specifically, her mother. The next morning I returned to First County Bank. Not because Richard requested another meeting. Because I had questions. Real questions. Questions that no longer felt frightening. The truth was something had changed inside me. Not anger. Not revenge. A boundary. For most of my life, I had treated boundaries as something other people needed. Difficult people. Selfish people. Demanding people. Not me. I was the accommodating one. The understanding one. The flexible one. At 70 years old, I was beginning to understand something embarrassingly late. Boundaries are not punishments. They're instructions. They teach people how to remain in your life. Richard greeted me with the same quiet kindness as before. This time, however, I didn't feel intimidated. I felt prepared. We sat in his office. Coffee between us. Morning sunlight filling the room. And for the first time, I asked the question directly. What exactly happens if Claire keeps treating me the way she has been? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied me, as though evaluating whether I truly wanted the answer. Apparently deciding I did, he nodded. The trust adjusts. The words were simple. Clinical. Yet their meaning was enormous. Adjusts how? Certain distributions become restricted. I absorbed that quietly. Not because of the money. Because of the intention. Thomas hadn't built a trap. He had built a safeguard. There was a difference. A significant one. Did he expect this? The question escaped before I could stop it. Richard looked out the window briefly. Then back at me. No. Relief flickered through me. Brief. Unexpected. Then he continued. I think he hoped he was wrong. That hurt. More than anything else. 'Cause it sounded exactly like Thomas. Practical enough to prepare. Loving enough to hope preparation wouldn't be necessary. On the drive home I thought about hope. Specifically the kind that survives too long. The kind mothers carry. The kind that convinces us tomorrow will be different. Next month will be different. Next year will be different. Maybe it will. Sometimes it isn't. Recognizing that isn't bitterness. It's maturity. Or at least that's what I was beginning to learn. 3 days later, Claire showed up unexpectedly. No phone call. No warning. Just a knock on the front door at 4:17 in the afternoon. When I opened it, she looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. The sort of exhaustion that follows weeks of losing arguments with yourself. Can I come in? Of course. We settled in the living room. No coffee. No small talk. No performance. That alone felt significant. Claire stared at the family photographs on the mantel, particularly the one of Thomas. Finally she spoke. Richard told me you came by. Interesting. Not surprising, but interesting. He did. A humorless smile crossed her face. Of course he did. I waited. She folded her hands tightly together, the same way she used to before difficult exams, before college interviews, before major presentations. Some habits survive adulthood. Then she asked the question, the real question, the one hiding behind every other conversation. Are you going to cut us off? There it was. Not hidden. Not disguised. Not polished. Fear. Raw and exposed. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. The little girl who drew suns with oversized rays. The teenager who wanted applause. The woman who had slowly forgotten the difference between love and validation. The mother who had wounded me. The daughter I still loved. All of them sat in front of me at once. No. The answer came gently. Immediately. Claire blinked. Apparently surprised. You're not. No. Confusion replaced fear. Then suspicion. Then why? She stopped. I finished the sentence for her. Why am I setting boundaries? Claire nodded. I leaned back in my chair, searching for words. Not legal words. Not financial words. Human words. Finally I found them. The trust was never about punishing you. Silence. It was about protecting me. More silence. I didn't understand that before. Claire stared at me. Listening. Actually listening. Perhaps for the first time in years. I'm not selling this house. The statement landed quietly. Firmly.
No anger. No negotiation.
I'm not moving into a condo. Her eyes lowered. I'm not handing over financial decisions. She nodded once. Barely. I understand. For some reason hearing those 2 words nearly made me cry. Not because they solved anything. Because they were the first honest thing she'd said in months. And Claire. She looked up. If you're going to be part of my life, I need you to stop managing me. The room became very still. I continued. You can disagree with me. She nodded. You can worry about me. Another nod. But you don't get to diminish me. The words settled between us. Heavy. Necessary. Long overdue. For a moment I thought she might argue. Defend herself. Explain. Instead she looked away. Toward the photograph of Thomas. Toward the man who had understood all of this long before either of us. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded very small. I don't know when I became that person. The honesty in the sentence broke my heart. Because I believed her. She truly didn't know. Most people don't notice themselves changing. Not while it's happening. After she left, I sat alone in the living room. Not devastated. Not victorious. Just calm. The kind of calm that arrives after making a difficult decision. The kind of calm that comes from finally telling the truth. Outside, evening settled across the neighborhood. The maple tree moved gently in the wind. A bicycle rolled past. Someone laughed in the distance. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet something fundamental had changed. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for Claire to become someone else. I was accepting who she was. And more importantly, I was finally accepting who I was. Not a burden. Not an embarrassment. Not a problem to solve. Just a woman who had spent a lifetime loving her family. And who had finally learned that love without boundaries isn't generosity. It's surrender. And I was finished surrendering. A week after my conversation with Claire, I bought fresh carnations. Pink and white. The same kind I had purchased for myself the day before Mother's Day. Only this time they felt different. The cashier at Kroger smiled as she scanned them. Special occasion? I thought about the question, then smiled. Not exactly. And for the first time that answer didn't make me sad. Because not every meaningful thing requires an occasion. Some things deserve recognition simply because they survived. Summer arrived slowly. The peonies bloomed. The tomatoes grew taller than expected. The maple tree filled out completely. Life continued. Not dramatically. Not perfectly. Simply steadily. Which I discovered was enough. For months I had expected some enormous confrontation. Some final explosion. Some moment where secrets spilled out and everyone changed overnight. Instead, reality chose a quieter path. The way it usually does. Claire called more often. Not constantly. Not performatively. Just more often. The conversations felt awkward at first. Like two people learning a language they should already know. Sometimes she caught herself slipping into old habits. Correcting. Managing. Explaining. And sometimes I caught myself slipping into old habits too. Excusing. Accommodating. Minimizing. Change rarely happens all at once. It happens conversation by conversation. Boundary by boundary. Choice by choice. Daniel surprised me the most. 3 weeks after our discussion, he stopped by one Saturday morning carrying a box of donuts.
No announcement. No agenda.
Just donuts. The gesture felt almost absurdly ordinary, which was exactly why it mattered. We sat on the back porch drinking coffee, watching birds move through the maple tree. For a while we talked about baseball, weather, home repairs. Then Daniel finally sighed. A long tired sigh. The kind a person releases when they've been carrying something for years. I owe you an apology. I looked at him quietly. He stared into his coffee cup, not meeting my eyes. I should have said something sooner. The words hung between us. Neither dramatic nor rehearsed. Just honest. You mean Mother's Day? Daniel laughed bitterly. No. A pause. Long before that. The answer didn't surprise me. Not anymore. Because once you start seeing clearly, certain truths become unavoidable. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place. The explanation sounded painfully familiar. People tell themselves that every day. At family gatherings. At workplaces. At dinner tables. They watch something wrong happen and convince themselves silence is neutrality. It isn't. Silence always chooses a side. Eventually Daniel looked up. I was wrong. I nodded. Not because forgiveness was immediate. Because honesty deserved acknowledgement. And for once that was all either of us needed. Sophie spent most of the summer at my house. Not living there. Simply visiting often. Studying on the porch. Reading in the garden. Helping me harvest tomatoes. The house seemed younger whenever she was around. One afternoon she sat at the kitchen table doing coursework while I baked blueberry muffins. Suddenly she looked up and smiled. What? She laughed. You seem happier. The observation caught me off guard. I considered it carefully, then nodded. I think I am. The answer surprised both of us. Because happiness wasn't exactly the right word. Peace was closer. For years I had confused peace with avoiding conflict. Now I understood they weren't the same thing at all. Avoiding conflict had cost me my dignity. Peace returned only after I reclaimed it. By August, Claire finally asked the question she'd been avoiding. We were sitting together on my porch. The evening air warm. The neighborhood quiet. She stared at the street for a long time before speaking. Do you think Dad would be disappointed in me? The question landed heavily. Not because I hadn't considered it. Because she clearly had. Many times. I thought about Thomas. About his patience. His practicality. His stubborn belief that people could do better if they chose to. Then I answered honestly. No. Claire looked surprised. He'd be worried. The surprise faded. replaced by understanding. I continued. But he always worried when he thought you were losing yourself. Tears gathered in her eyes. This time she didn't hide them. I don't know when everything became about money. The confession came quietly, more to herself than to me. I thought about that for a moment, then shook my head. I don't think it was ever about money. She frowned. What do you mean? I looked toward the garden, toward the tomatoes, toward the life Thomas and I built one ordinary day at a time. Then back at my daughter. I think it was about fear. Silence. Deep silence. The kind that arrives when someone hears something true. You wanted security. She nodded slowly. You wanted certainty. Another nod. You wanted control. A tear slipped down her cheek. And suddenly I saw it clearly. The trust. The inheritance. The house. The expectations. None of them had been the real issue. They were symptoms. The real issue was fear. Fear of losing status. Fear of instability. Fear of disappointment. Fear of becoming insignificant. The same fears that drive half the world. The difference was that fear had convinced Claire to treat people she loved like obstacles. And fear always charges interest. Eventually the bill comes due. The trust remained unchanged. The house remained mine. The boundaries remained in place. That part never shifted. Because forgiveness and access are not the same thing. A lesson I learned embarrassingly late. Claire was welcome in my life, but not in control of it. The distinction mattered. And for the first time she seemed to understand. Autumn arrived. The maple leaves turned gold. The mornings grew cooler. One Saturday afternoon, Sophie helped me sort old photographs in the dining room. Boxes covered the table. Decades of family history. At one point she held up a photograph from her childhood. The four of us standing on the beach. Thomas smiling. Claire laughing. Me holding Sophie's hand. Look at Grandpa. I smiled. He always hated having his picture taken. I miss him. So do I. We sat quietly for a moment. Then Sophie surprised me. Do you think he knew all this would happen? I looked at the photograph. At Thomas's calm expression. At the man who had seen more than he ever said. Then I shook my head. No. Really? No. I smiled softly. I think he hoped it wouldn't. That felt closer to the truth. Thomas didn't build protections because he expected failure. He built them because love prepares for possibilities, even painful ones. December brought the first snow. The neighborhood looked transformed. White rooftops.
Bare branches.
Christmas lights glowing against the early darkness. The house felt warm. Lived in. Loved. Not because everything was fixed. Because it wasn't. Some wounds remained. Some conversations still felt careful. Some trust would take years to rebuild. Maybe longer. That was reality. Not every relationship returns to what it once was. Sometimes the healthiest outcome is simply honesty. On Christmas Eve, Sophie arrived first. Then Daniel. Then a little later, Claire. She stood in the doorway holding a pie. Store-bought. A terrible choice compared to homemade. Thomas would have teased her mercilessly. The thought made me laugh. What? Claire asked. Nothing. I took the pie from her. It's perfect. She smiled. A real smile. Not polished. Not strategic. Just real. I hadn't seen one in a very long time. That night, after everyone left, I stood alone in the kitchen. The dishes were done. The lights were dim. Outside, snow drifted quietly across the yard. On the table sat a vase of carnations. Pink and white. Fresh. Beautiful. Unremarkable. I touched one of the petals gently, then looked around the room. The same kitchen. The same house. The same life. Yet everything felt different. Not because I had won something. Because I had finally stopped losing myself. For years, I believed dignity was something other people could give or take away. A compliment. An invitation. A seat at the table. A kind word. I was wrong. Dignity begins much earlier than that. It begins the moment you decide your value isn't determined by someone else's approval. Even your child's. Especially your child's. I turned off the kitchen light. The room fell softly into shadow. Before heading upstairs, I paused beside the carnations one last time. The same flowers I had bought for myself after Mother's Day. The same flowers that once felt like a substitute for love. Now they meant something different. A reminder that being remembered by others is lovely, but remembering your own worth is essential. Then I climbed the stairs, slowly, peacefully, leaving behind a year that had broken my heart and given it back to me stronger than before.